I thought I was marrying the man of my dreams until my future mother-in-law shoved a 40-page prenuptial agreement in my face, just 45 minutes before I walked down the aisle. "Sign it, gold digger," she whispered, threatening to humiliate my elderly parents sitting in the front pew. But as a senior auditor, I never sign anything without checking the receipts, and the $84,000 of proof I held would absolutely destroy their fake high society legacy. 45 minutes. That was exactly how long I had left, until the heavy bow oak doors of St. Paul's Episcopal Church would swing open. The centuries-old stone walls of the Connecticut church held a cool, damp chill, but inside the bridal suite, the air was suffocating. I stood in front of the full-length antique mirror, smoothing the delicate lace of my custom silk gown. My hands were shaking slightly. It was normal to be nervous on your wedding day, right? I was 34 years old, a senior auditor at a top financial firm in Manhattan, a woman used to facing down intimidating corporate boards without blinking. Yet here I was, my stomach tied in knots, over marrying Harrison Kensington. My 3 bridesmaids were fluttering around me, fixing my train and handing me glasses of water when the heavy wooden door creaked open. Beatrice Kensington walked in. Harrison's mother was a woman who wore her old money status like a suit of armor. Today she was draped in pale silver silk, her neck heavy with pearls, her face perfectly lifted and powdered. Usually she maintained a polite, if somewhat frosty distance, but the look on her face right now was completely different. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Girls," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the soft chatter of the room like a blade. "I need a moment alone with my future daughter-in-law. Give us the room." My friends exchanged confused glances, but Beatrice stood there with a posture that demanded absolute obedience. One by one, they filed out, closing the heavy door behind them. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. I turned to her with a polite smile, assuming she was here to give me a family heirloom or share a traditional motherly sentiment before the ceremony. Before I could even speak, Beatrice marched over to the vanity table. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal-sized paper. With a loud, heavy thud, she slapped the document down right next to my bouquet of white roses. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked down at the thick black binding. The words "prenuptial agreement" were printed in bold letters across the top page. Beatrice let out a short, dry laugh. The sound sent a shiver straight down my spine. Her perfectly painted lips curled into a sneer that stripped away every ounce of the refined society matron she pretended to be. "It is exactly what it looks like, Olivia. It is a legally binding agreement that protects the Kensington legacy from people like you." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what was happening. "People like me," I repeated. Beatrice took a step closer. The overwhelming stench of her heavy floral perfume invaded my senses, making me nauseous. "Yes, people like you. Did you really think we were just going to let some middle-class bean counter walk into our family and lay claim to what generations of Kensingtons have built? Did you honestly believe you were my equals?" My heart began to pound against my ribs. The corset of my dress suddenly felt like a vice. I looked at the 40-page document, then back at her. Beatrice Harrison and I talked about this months ago. He said a prenup was unnecessary. We are building our lives together. Beatrice let out another harsh laugh, crossing her arms over her silver silk dress. "Harrison says a lot of things to keep the peace. He is a gentleman. He did not want to hurt your feelings, but I am not burdened by such sentimentality. You are a 34-year-old woman from a no-name town in Ohio. Your father was a high school math teacher, and your mother worked at a local bakery. You are nothing but a gold digger who managed to polish herself up just enough to trick my son." Blood rushed to my face, my cheeks burning with a mixture of profound humiliation and rising anger. How dare she speak about my parents like that? My parents who had driven 16 hours straight just to be here. They were sitting in the very front pew right now, wearing their best clothes, beaming with pride, because they thought their daughter was marrying into a wonderful, loving family. I took a steadying breath, trying to summon the professional composure I used in my career. "Beatrice, I am not signing a legal document 45 minutes before my wedding. This is coercion. If Harrison wants this, he can come in here and ask me himself. Beatrice leaned in so close, I could see the cold, hard glint in her pale blue eyes. Harrison is not coming in here. He knows exactly what I am doing, and he fully supports it. In fact, his signature is already on the last page. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the thick stack of paper. You have two choices, Olivia. You pick up a pen, and you sign away any and all rights to marital support, alimony, and the Kensington estate. Or I walk out of those doors right now. I tell the priest the wedding is off, and I announce to the entire congregation of our wealthy friends that we caught you trying to extort my son. I will humiliate you. More importantly, I will humiliate those pathetic, starry-eyed parents of yours sitting in the front row. I will make sure they walk out of this church with their heads bowed in total disgrace. The floor beneath my feet seemed to tilt. The oxygen vanished from the room. My ears were ringing so loudly, I could barely hear the faint sound of the organ warming up in the main sanctuary. Harrison knew. The man who had kissed my forehead this morning, the man who had promised to love and cherish me, had orchestrated this ambush. He knew his mother was going to corner me when I was at my most vulnerable, trapped in a white dress, surrounded by hundreds of guests, with my elderly parents waiting proudly in the chapel. He had used my love for my family as a weapon against me. I looked at the reflection of my dress in the mirror. It was a custom silk gown that my mother had spent months helping me choose. My parents had sacrificed so much to put me through college, working double shifts so I could graduate debt-free and conquer the financial world of New York. To them, Harrison was the handsome, successful man who was going to take care of their little girl. They had welcomed him into their home, cooked him meals, and treated him like a son. The thought of Beatrice walking out there and publicly branding me a gold digger, watching my father's proud face crumble in humiliation in front of 300 strangers, made a hot, suffocating rage rise in my throat. I stepped closer to the vanity and looked down at the document. My trained eyes instinctively scanned the top page. It was brutal. It was not a standard protection of premarital assets. It was a complete and total surrender. There was a clause stating I waived all rights to our primary residence, even if I contributed to the mortgage. There was a penalty clause that stated if I initiated a divorce, I would walk away with zero spousal support, regardless of how long we were married or if I had sacrificed my career for children. It was a document designed to keep me trapped, compliant, and entirely dependent on the Kensington family's whims. And at the very bottom of the page, I saw Harrison's signature. The ink was fresh. Beatrice noticed my eyes lingering on the signature. Her smile grew wider, a predator admiring her trapped prey. Yes, he signed it this morning, she purred, her voice dripping with satisfaction. He finally realized that love is fleeting, but wealth is permanent. He understands that a woman of your pedigree is inherently a liability. We cannot risk you trying to extract half of his net worth down the line. You should be grateful we are even allowing you to marry him at all. Most families of our stature would have forbidden it entirely. A liability. I almost laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of this woman calling me a liability when I had literally funded this entire circus. I thought back to the past 6 months. Every time a vendor needed to be paid, Harrison's credit card would miraculously decline, or his wire transfer would get delayed by the bank. "Honey, can you just cover this deposit? I will wire you the cash on Friday," he would say with that perfect, charming smile. Friday never came, but I never pushed him. I never audited my own fiancé. I was so desperate to prove to Beatrice that I wasn't after their money that I gladly opened my own wallet to prove my independence. I had played right into their hands. They had bled my savings dry, and now they were using my fear of social ruin to lock me into a legally binding cage. As a senior auditor, my entire career was built on detecting fraud. My job was to look at a perfectly balanced spreadsheet and find the hidden lies, the missing funds, the rotten core hidden beneath a glossy surface. But I had been completely blind to the fraud in my own personal life. I had been so desperately in love that I ignored the red flags. I ignored how Harrison always deflected questions about his finances. I ignored how Beatrice constantly belittled my career, calling it tedious and unglamorous. I had let them treat me like a bank account with a pulse. Beatrice pulled a silver pen from her purse and placed it on top of the prenup. "The clock is ticking, Olivia. The organist is finishing the prelude. Your bridesmaids are waiting in the hall. Sign the paper. Or I go out there and I destroy your family." The heavy silence of the damp stone room pressed in on me. I looked at the pen. I looked at Beatrice's smug, powdered face. The pain of Harrison's betrayal was a dull, throbbing ache in my chest, but the protective fury I felt for my parents was a blazing inferno. I knew that if I signed this paper, I would be signing away my dignity forever. I would be trapped in a marriage built on extortion and lies. The soft, naive woman who had walked into this bridal suite was dead. She died the moment Beatrice threatened my parents. In her place, a cold, calculating professional awoke. I did not scream. I did not cry. Crying would ruin my makeup, and I needed to look flawless for what I was about to do. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy reality of my situation settle into my bones. Harrison was a coward. He was hiding behind his mother's designer skirts, letting her do his dirty work while he waited at the altar, looking like the perfect gentleman. He thought I was just a desperate middle-class woman who would sign anything to avoid public embarrassment. He thought my fear of ruining the wedding would override my common sense. He thought wrong. I reached out and let my fingers graze the cold silver barrel of the pen. Beatrice's eyes gleamed with triumphant arrogance. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken me. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed that a woman who works with numbers all day has no spine. She assumed that because I came from a modest background, I would bow down to her fake aristocratic intimidation. I picked up the pen. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Harrison stepped into the bridal suite. He looked flawless in his custom tuxedo, his hair perfectly swept back, his smile radiating the gentle warmth that had fooled me for 5 years. To anyone else, he was the picture of a devoted groom, eager to see his bride. To me, he was a predator, wearing a remarkably well-tailored mask. "Olivia, you look absolutely breathtaking," he said, his voice dropping into that intimate, husky tone he always used when he wanted to charm me. He walked across the stone floor and reached out to take my hands. I forced myself not to recoil from his touch. His skin felt warm, but the physical contact sent a sickening shudder through my stomach. I kept my face perfectly composed, offering him a soft, demure smile through the sheer tulle of my veil. "Thank you, Harrison," I replied smoothly. My heart was pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was operating with the cold precision of an audit in its final stages. Harrison glanced down at the vanity table, his eyes locking onto the thick stack of the prenuptial agreement. A flicker of something calculated passed through his gaze before he quickly masked it with a look of weary apology. He let go of my hands and sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if he were carrying the weight of the world. "I see my mother was here," he murmured, shaking his head. "Olivia, I am so incredibly sorry about this." I told her over and over that a prenup was completely unnecessary. We are building a life together, not a business merger. But you know how she gets. She is so paranoid about the family legacy. She went behind my back to the lawyers and had this drawn up. She insisted it was the only way she would give us her blessing. I watched him perform. It was a spectacular display of gaslighting. If I had not just read the text messages on his iPad, if I had not seen his own words commanding his mother to force my signature to save their bankrupt estate, I would have believed every single syllable. I would have comforted him, told him it was not his fault, and signed the document just to relieve his manufactured stress. "It is quite a document," I said mildly, picking up the silver pen Beatrice had left behind. She mentioned something about calling off the wedding and embarrassing my parents if I refused to sign it. Harrison widened his eyes perfectly, feigning shock and outrage. "She said what, Olivia? That is completely unacceptable. I'm going to march out there right now and tell her this is over. We do not need her blessing. We do not need this paper." He took a half step toward the door, a theatrical pause designed entirely to make me stop him. And like a dutiful, naive bride, I played my assigned role. "No, Harrison, wait," I said, reaching out to touch his arm. My voice was steady, betraying none of the absolute disgust boiling underneath. "Do not cause a scene. The guests are already seated. Your mother's friends are out there. Let us just keep the peace." He stopped, turning back to me with a look of profound, manufactured gratitude. He took my hand again, squeezing it gently. "Are you sure, sweetheart? I hate that she put you in this position." "It is just a meaningless piece of paper. It changes nothing about us. Once the wedding is over and she calms down, we can have the lawyers dissolve it. Just sign it so we can get out there and start our beautiful life together. Just a meaningless piece of paper. Just a formality to keep the Kensington estate out of foreclosure." My professional mind cataloged every lie falling from his lips. I gave him a soft, reassuring nod. "I understand, Harrison. I will sign it." His shoulders noticeably dropped as a wave of genuine relief washed over him. The tension he had been carrying, the desperate need to secure his financial lifeline, visibly dissolved. "Thank you, Olivia. You have no idea how much I love you," he whispered, leaning in to press a kiss to my cheek through the veil. "I will see you at the altar." He turned and walked out of the suite, closing the door behind him. The moment the latch clicked, the submissive smile vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, stony resolve. I was not just going to walk away. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire operation. Before I could even review my next move, the door swung open again. This time it was Harrison's younger sister, Stephanie. She bustled into the room, her emerald green bridesmaid dress rustling loudly. Stephanie had always been a carbon copy of her mother, dripping with unearned arrogance and a toxic sense of superiority. "Olivia, the wedding planner, says we have 5 minutes until the processional begins," Stephanie announced, not bothering to make eye contact as she dropped to her knees to unnecessarily fluff the train of my silk gown. I looked down at her. "Thank you, Stephanie. I am just finishing up." Stephanie stood up and brushed her hands together. She glanced at the prenup on the vanity, a cruel, knowing smirk playing on her lips. "I see Mother paid you a visit. It is really for the best, Olivia. You have to understand that our family cannot just let anyone walk in and attach themselves to our assets." I kept my voice perfectly neutral. "Of course, it is important to protect your investments." Stephanie laughed, a sharp nasal sound. "Exactly, especially right now. Between you and me, Harrison has been incredibly stressed. That massive commercial loan approval is happening next week, and the bank executives are sitting right in the 3rd row today. Mother invited them specifically so they could see the wedding. It is all about projecting stability, you know." The air in the room suddenly felt electric. The tension spiked instantly as my auditing instincts flared. A commercial loan approval next week. I stared at Stephanie, carefully keeping my expression blank, while my mind raced through the financial data I knew to be true. Harrison did not have the credit or the collateral to secure a massive commercial loan. His boutique consulting firm had reported losses for the last 3 quarters. If the Kensington estate was facing foreclosure, their family trust was utterly depleted. They had zero leverage, unless... A cold, hard realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Unless they were not using their own financial standing to secure the loan. Unless they were using mine. I have flawless credit. I have zero debt. And in 2 weeks, my grandfather's massive trust fund becomes fully accessible to me. "That is wonderful news about the loan," I said, casually turning back to the mirror to adjust an earring. I did not realize Harrison was expanding his business so aggressively. Stephanie waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, you know Harrison, always making big moves. Anyway, I need to get back to the staging area. Do not keep everyone waiting, Olivia. We certainly did not spend all this time planning just for you to drag your feet." She turned and marched out of the room. I stood frozen, my mind processing her final insult. We certainly did not spend all this time planning. The sheer audacity of her statement echoed in the stone room. The Kensingtons had not spent a single dime on this wedding. I had covered the venue, the catering, the floral arrangements, the string quartet, and the open bar. $84,000 drained directly from my personal savings account over the past 6 months because Harrison's cards kept mysteriously declining. Stephanie's accidental slip about the commercial loan was the final missing piece of the puzzle. This was not just a case of a wealthy family trying to protect their assets from a middle-class bride. This was a family of bankrupt frauds actively trying to steal my financial identity to save themselves from total ruin. I walked over to the heavy oak door and turned the brass lock securing the room. I needed proof, and I needed it right now. I marched into the small attached bridal bathroom where I had stashed my personal tote bag. I pulled out my company-issued laptop, flipping it open and powering it up on the marble counter. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced, relentless speed. I logged into my secure public records database, a tool I use daily for corporate audits. I bypassed the standard searches and dug directly into the state's commercial lending registries. I ran a query on Harrison's name, his social security number, and the newly formed LLC he had mentioned starting a month ago. The search icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds before the results populated the screen. A massive, fraudulent commercial loan application stared back at me. The requested amount was $500,000. The primary applicant was Harrison's LLC. But it was the secondary guarantor section that made the blood freeze in my veins. My name was listed as the primary guarantor, my social security number, my employment history, and a forged digital signature that looked remarkably similar to my own. They had not just planned to marry me for my trust fund. They had already used my pristine financial standing to apply for a $500,000 loan to bail out their foreclosed estate. The bank executives sitting in the 3rd row of the church were not just wedding guests. They were the loan officers invited by Beatrice to witness the glorious union that would officially bind my assets to the Kensington debt. If I walked out there and said I do, if I signed that prenuptial agreement validating our financial merger, I would be legally tethered to a $500,000 of fraudulent debt. A wave of absolute, unadulterated rage washed over me. I did not feel a single ounce of heartbreak anymore. The sorrow of losing my fiancé was completely annihilated by the vicious reality of his crime. I scrolled further down the loan documentation, tracing the destination accounts listed for the initial disbursement. My eyes locked onto a recurring wire transfer scheduled for a luxury apartment lease in downtown Boston. I recognized the address. It was a high-end building completely out of Harrison's supposed price range. I pulled my phone from my purse and opened the photos I had taken of Harrison's iPad. I zoomed in on the contact list in his messages. There was a contact saved simply as C with a Boston area code. I cross-referenced the area code and the address. It was a perfect match. I opened the text thread with C. The messages loaded, and the ultimate insult punched the breath from my lungs. See, the baby is kicking so much today, I cannot believe I'm already 5 months along. When are you coming back to Boston, Harrison, soon, babe? Just have to get through this circus today. Once she signs the papers and the loan clears on Monday, I will transfer the first 6 months of rent to your account. I love you. I stared at the glowing screen. Chloe, his event planner. The woman who had supposedly been managing our vendor contracts from her remote office in Boston. Harrison and Beatrice were not just using my money to save their bankrupt estate. They were using my stolen money to fund a lavish luxury apartment for his pregnant mistress and their unborn heir. They had laughed at me while I paid $84,000 for my own fake wedding, all while plotting to saddle me with a $500,000 fraudulent loan so Harrison could play house with another woman. The conflict reached its absolute explosive peak. I slammed the laptop shut. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal required a response that would echo through their high society circles for the rest of their miserable lives. I walked back into the main suite and stood before the vanity. I picked up Beatrice's silver pen. I was not going to run away. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I flipped to the signature page of the 40-page prenuptial agreement. I signed my name with bold, aggressive strokes. But right beneath my signature, utilizing a specific legal loophole I knew would invalidate the entire document under fraud and duress, I added a tiny, almost imperceptible addendum referencing the forged commercial loan. It secured the physical proof of Beatrice's extortion. I grabbed my phone and quickly drafted a text to my mentor, attorney Richard Hayes. Richard was a ruthless corporate lawyer who treated me like a daughter. I attached the screenshots of the iPad, the forged loan documents, and the texts from the pregnant mistress. Richard. I am standing in my wedding dress. Harrison forged my signature on a $500,000 commercial loan and is hiding a pregnant mistress. The bank executives approving the loan are sitting in the third row of the church. I am walking down the aisle in exactly 5 minutes. Be ready. Richard's reply came through 10 seconds later. I am in the second pew. I have already contacted the Financial Crimes Unit. Walk down that aisle, Olivia. Burn them down. I slipped my phone and a small thumb drive containing every single receipt text message and forged document into the hidden pocket of my silk gown. I picked up my bouquet of white roses. I looked at myself in the antique mirror one last time. The naive bride was dead. The senior auditor was ready to present her findings. A sharp knock on the heavy oak door echoed through the bridal suite, shattering the silence. I quickly shoved my phone deep into the hidden pocket of my silk gown, right next to the flash drive containing the evidence of my ruined life. I smoothed my hands down the front of my dress, forcing my breathing to steady. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my mind was already locking into a state of absolute chilling clarity. "Come in," I called out, my voice miraculously smooth. The door opened and Harrison stepped into the room. He looked flawless. His custom-tailored black tuxedo fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair was expertly swept back, and his warm hazel eyes locked onto me with that familiar, charming gaze. This was the man I had spent the last 5 years loving with every fiber of my being. This was the man who had held me when I was stressed from tax season, the man who brought me coffee in bed, the man who promised me a lifetime of safety and devotion. Now looking at him, I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. I was looking at a predator wearing the skin of my best friend. "Olivia?" "My God, you look absolutely breathtaking," he said softly. He closed the door behind him and walked across the stone floor, his eyes sweeping over my custom lace gown. His voice was pitched to that intimate, husky tone he always used when he wanted to make me feel like the center of his universe. He reached out to take my hands. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to violently recoil from his touch. His skin felt warm, his grip strong and reassuring, but the physical contact sent a sickening shudder straight down to my stomach. I maintained a perfectly composed face, offering him a soft, demure smile through the sheer tulle of my veil. "Thank you, Harrison," I replied. I kept my tone light, almost shy. Behind my polite facade, my professional auditing mind was waking up, cataloging his every move, every micro-expression, every calculated breath. Harrison let go of my hands and let out a long, heavy sigh. He ran his fingers through his hair, intentionally ruining the perfect styling, just a bit to appear genuinely distressed. He glanced down at the vanity table, his eyes locking instantly onto the thick stack of the prenuptial agreement his mother had left behind. A momentary flicker of cold calculation flashed in his hazel eyes, but he masked it immediately. He turned back to me with a look of weary, exhausted apology, playing the role of the beleaguered son perfectly. "I see my mother was here," he murmured, shaking his head slowly. "Olivia, I am so incredibly sorry about this. I am so angry with her right now, I can barely see straight. I told her over and over that a prenup was completely unnecessary. I told her we are building a life together, not a corporate business merger. But you know how she gets. She is so utterly paranoid about the family legacy. She went entirely behind my back to her lawyers and had this drawn up. She insisted it was the only way she would ever give us her blessing. I stood there and watched him perform. It was a spectacular, terrifying display of gaslighting. If I had not just read his own text messages on his synced iPad, if I had not seen him tell his pregnant mistress that my trust fund was the only thing saving his bankrupt family from foreclosure, I would have believed every single syllable falling from his mouth. The old Olivia, the naive woman who walked into this room an hour ago, would have rushed to comfort him. She would have told him it was not his fault. She would have signed the document without a second thought, just to relieve his manufactured stress and protect his relationship with his mother. But the old Olivia was dead. I looked at his handsome face and felt nothing but a glacial, absolute rage. It is quite an intense document. Harrison, I said loudly, picking up the silver pen Beatrice had left behind. I twirled it slowly between my fingers. She mentioned something about calling off the wedding right now and publicly embarrassing my parents in front of the entire congregation if I refused to sign it. She said she would announce that I was extorting you. Harrison widened his eyes, a masterful portrait of shock and outrage. She said, "What, Olivia? That is completely unacceptable. That is insane. I am going to march out there right now and tell her this wedding is over. We do not need her blessing. We do not need this paper. We can go to City Hall on Monday. I will not let her treat you this way." He took a dramatic, purposeful half step toward the door. It was a theatrical pause, an obvious bluff designed entirely to make me panic and stop him. He knew exactly how much my parents meant to me. He knew they had driven 16 hours from Ohio just to see their only daughter walk down the aisle. He knew they were sitting in the very front pew right now, wearing their best clothes, beaming with pride, utterly unaware of the vipers surrounding them. He was using my love and my fierce protective instinct for my family as a weapon to manipulate me into submission. And like a dutiful, terrified bride, I played my assigned role to perfection. "No, Harrison, wait," I said, reaching out to gently touch his arm. I injected a slight tremor into my voice, projecting the image of a woman desperately trying to hold her dream wedding together. "Do not cause a scene right now. The guests are already seated. Your mother brought all those important bank executives from Boston. My parents are so happy. Let us just keep the peace. Please, Harrison." He stopped immediately. He turned back to me, his shoulders dropping as a wave of genuine relief washed over his features. The underlying tension he had been carrying, the desperate need to secure his financial lifeline, visibly melted away. He took both of my hands in his, pulling me a step closer. His eyes were wide and pleading, filled with a fake sincerity that made my stomach churn. "Are you absolutely sure, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "I hate that my mother put you in this terrible position on what is supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. I feel like I have failed to protect you, but you have to know it is just a meaningless piece of paper. It changes absolutely nothing about us. It is just legal jargon to make an old paranoid woman feel secure about a house she rarely even lives in." I looked into his eyes, dissecting his lies line by line. Just a meaningless piece of paper. He was standing there, holding my hands, looking like a prince, while actively conspiring to steal my identity. He wanted me to sign away my rights to any marital support, to surrender my future, so he could drain my trust fund and support his mistress. He thought I was a foolish, starry-eyed girl who would rather sign a fraudulent contract than face a momentary social embarrassment. "I need to ask Harrison," I said. My voice soft, hesitant. "Have you read it? There are clauses in here that state I walk away with absolutely zero spousal support if we divorce, even if I quit my career to raise our children. It says I waive all rights to our primary residence." It feels very extreme. Harrison sighed, squeezing my hands tighter. He shifted his stance, moving into the next phase of his manipulation. "Olivia, you are a senior auditor. You look at risk for a living. You are reading this like a hostile corporate contract, not like a partnership. I have not even read the whole thing because I do not care what it says. I am never going to divorce you. I am never going to let you walk away with nothing. We are going to have a beautiful family and everything I build will be ours. You know my heart. You know I would never leave you destitute. Do you really think I would let my mother throw you out on the street?" "Yes, I thought clearly. You absolutely would. You are already planning on it." He brought one of my hands up to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "Please, Olivia, do not let her win by ruining our day. Do not let her paranoia destroy what we have built for 5 years. Once the wedding is over and she calms down, we can have our own lawyers review it and dissolve it. But right now, my mother is holding our wedding hostage. Just sign it. Let us get out there, say our vows, and start our beautiful life together. Just you and me." "Just you, me and your pregnant event planner," I added silently. The sheer audacity of his performance was almost impressive. He was asking me to ignore my professional training, my financial literacy, and my basic common sense, all in the name of love. He was using the last 5 years of my devotion as leverage to force me into a cage. He was banking on the fact that I was too polite, too deeply ingrained with middle-class manners to make a scene at my own wedding. As I stared at him, the final remnants of my heartbreak evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and ruthless clarity. The old Olivia might have signed that paper out of blind trust, but the woman standing in front of him now was a seasoned financial auditor who had just uncovered a massive fraud scheme. I realized in that exact moment that I could not just walk away. My initial instinct had been to run, to grab my parents, storm out the back doors of the church, and leave the Kensington family to deal with their own mess. But walking away was no longer an option. If I just walked away, Harrison and his mother would spin the narrative. They would tell their wealthy friends that I got cold feet, or worse, that they discovered I was a gold digger and called off the wedding themselves. They would protect their fake high society reputation. And more importantly, walking away would not expose the fraudulent $500,000 commercial loan they had already filed using my forged signature. If I just left, they might still find a way to access those funds. They might still find a way to ruin my credit and steal my grandfather's trust fund. I needed to stay. I needed to let them think they had won. I needed to walk down that aisle and stand in front of their rich friends, their banking partners, and their entire corrupt world. I needed to publicly, legally, and financially execute them where they stood. I looked down at the prenup on the vanity. Then I looked back up at Harrison. I let my shoulders relax, mimicking the posture of a woman who was tired of fighting a woman who had decided to surrender to love. "You are right, Harrison," I whispered, forcing a tender, vulnerable smile onto my face. "I'm sorry, I'm just so stressed and your mother really frightened me. I know you would never let anything bad happen to me. I trust you." Harrison let out a breath he had clearly been holding. His entire body visibly sagged with relief. He pulled me into a gentle hug, being careful not to crush my veil. "Thank you, Olivia. You are the most amazing woman in the world. I promise you this is the last time my mother will ever interfere in our lives. From now on, it is just us." I rested my chin on his shoulder, staring blankly at the cold stone wall behind him. "I promise you, Harrison." I thought my mind sharpening like a freshly whetted blade. "This is indeed the last time your mother will ever interfere in my life." I pulled back and offered him one final reassuring smile. I picked up the silver pen. Harrison watched me eagerly as I leaned over the vanity. I flipped to the back page. I signed my name with bold, deliberate strokes, exactly where Beatrice had demanded. But right below my signature, I added a tiny, legally binding notation. It was a specific auditing code and a legal phrase referencing signing under duress and ongoing financial fraud investigations. To the untrained eye, it looked like a messy continuation of my signature loop. To an attorney or a judge, it was an absolute invalidation of the entire 40-page document. I set the pen down. "There," I said, turning back to him. "It is done." Harrison beamed. He picked up the document, his eyes gleaming with a greedy satisfaction he could not quite hide. He did not even bother to look closely at my signature. He was too arrogant, too certain of his own victory to double-check the details. He rolled the document up and tapped it against his leg. "I will go hand this to my mother so she can call off her dogs," he said cheerfully. "Then I am going to wait for you at the altar. I cannot wait to make you my wife, Olivia." "I will be right out," I replied smoothly. He blew me a kiss and slipped out the door, moving with the light, energetic step of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen $500,000. I stood alone in the quiet bridal suite. The facade of the submissive bride immediately fell away. My heart rate slowed down to a calm, steady rhythm. The pain was completely gone, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and raw, undeniable power. I had the forged loan documents. I had the text messages. I had the receipts for the $84,000 I had personally spent on this fraudulent spectacle. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and felt the cold, hard edges of the flash drive. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Now, all I had to do was walk out there and spring the lock. Just as I turned back to the mirror to do a final check of my makeup, the heavy oak door swung open once again without a knock. Harrison's sister Stephanie marched into the room, holding a walkie-talkie and looking severely irritated. The heavy brass handle of the oak door turned with a sharp metallic click. The door swung inward, scraping slightly against the uneven stone floor of the centuries-old church. I expected to see one of my own bridesmaids returning, but instead Harrison's younger sister Stephanie marched into the room. She was wearing her custom emerald green bridesmaid dress, a garment I had personally paid $2,000 for because she claimed her credit card was compromised the week the bridal shop needed the final deposit. Stephanie was the exact replica of her mother, Beatrice. She shared the same pale blue eyes, the same sharp, angular jawline, and the same deeply ingrained sense of unearned superiority. She carried herself as if the ground she walked on should be grateful for the pressure of her designer heels. In her left hand, she held a half-empty flute of expensive champagne, the vintage I had meticulously selected and funded for the reception. She closed the door behind her with a definitive thud, shutting out the faint melodic hum of the string quartet playing in the main sanctuary. We were completely alone. I watched her approach through the reflection in the antique vanity mirror. Stephanie had always treated me with a thinly veiled condescension. To her, I was just a boring middle-class accountant from Ohio who lacked the proper pedigree to sit at the Kensington dining table. She tolerated me only because Harrison demanded it, and because I was exceptionally useful when it came to picking up the tab at expensive dinners. Right now, her cheeks were flushed with alcohol and the thrill of the day. She did not bother to offer a warm wedding day greeting. She did not tell me I looked beautiful. Instead, she set her champagne glass down on the edge of the mahogany table, her eyes scanning my face for any lingering signs of distress after her mother's brutal ambush. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, my spine straight, and my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was a senior corporate auditor. I made a living staring down aggressive executives who tried to hide millions in offshore accounts. A spoiled 26-year-old socialite was not going to see me sweat. Stephanie let out a soft, dramatic sigh and dropped to her knees behind me. "The wedding planner sent me to check on you," she said, her tone dripping with fake concern. She grabbed the delicate silk train of my gown and began to forcefully yank the fabric, supposedly smoothing it out, but her movements were rough and careless. "You have 5 minutes until the processional begins, Olivia. We certainly cannot have the bride looking like a wrinkled mess in front of half of Connecticut's high society." I stood perfectly still, looking straight ahead at my own reflection. "Thank you, Stephanie," I replied, my voice remarkably calm and steady. "I appreciate your help." She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the cold stone walls. "Oh, please do not pretend you are actually grateful. I saw my mother leave this room. I know exactly what she made you do." Stephanie yanked the silk tulle one more time hard enough to make me stumble backward half an inch. She stood up and stepped into my line of sight, crossing her arms over her chest. Her pale blue eyes were alight with malicious joy. "You really are pathetic, you know that. You were so desperate to marry into our family that you actually signed it. You signed away everything just to secure the Kensington name." I kept my breathing slow and measured, inhaling the suffocating scent of lilies and the sharp tang of alcohol on her breath. I did not rise to the bait. I simply stared at her, allowing a mask of mild, submissive confusion to settle over my features. Stephanie fueled by my silence, and the champagne took a step closer. The arrogant smirk on her face widened into a triumphant sneer. "Do you want to know the absolute best part of this entire day?" she whispered, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "My mother and I were taking bets on how far we could push you. We sat in our living room 6 months ago and laughed about it. We realized early on that you were so terrified of looking like a gold digger, so desperate to prove you were an independent modern woman, that you would gladly empty your own bank accounts to impress us. And you did. You fell for it completely." I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach as Stephanie continued her relentless verbal assault. "Do you honestly think Harrison kept forgetting his checkbook by accident?" She asked, her voice dripping with sheer condescension. "Do you think his black card mysteriously declined at the florist, the caterer, and the venue out of pure bad luck?" Wake up, Olivia. We did not spend a single solitary dime on this entire spectacle. You paid for the imported white roses. You paid for the 5-course Wagyu beef dinner. You paid for the string quartet from Boston, the open bar, and even the dress I am wearing right now. You spent $84,000 of your own hard-earned pathetic savings to throw a party for our friends. And then, after draining your bank account to buy your way into our world, you just signed a legal document ensuring you leave with absolutely nothing. You bought your own cage, Olivia. The absolute cruelty of her words hung in the damp air of the bridal suite. They had played me. For 6 months, Harrison had played the role of the stressed, temporarily cash-poor entrepreneur. He would kiss my forehead, apologize profusely, and promise to wire me the money as soon as his clients settled their invoices. I had transferred thousands of dollars week after week, draining the savings I had meticulously built over a decade of 60-hour work weeks, all to fund a lavish high society wedding that I never even wanted. I wanted a small ceremony in a garden. They demanded the Ritz-Carlton catering and the historic church. And I paid for it, smiling like a fool, eager to please a family that viewed me as nothing more than an ATM with a heartbeat. I forced my hands to remain loosely clasped in front of me, digging my fingernails into my palms to ground myself. "You have a very beautiful family, Stephanie," I said, my voice eerily soft. "I am just happy the day came together so perfectly." Stephanie rolled her eyes, clearly disappointed that I was not sobbing or screaming. She reached for her champagne flute and took a long, arrogant sip. "Well, you should be happy," she countered, waving the crystal glass in the air. "The timing of this wedding is absolutely flawless. My mother is a genius. She invited the entire senior executive board from First National Bank today. They are sitting right there in the 3rd row, watching you parade around in that silk gown. They are watching the Kensington family project total unshakable wealth and stability. It is exactly the kind of show we needed to put on." I kept my face blank, though a tiny alarm bell began to ring in the back of my mind. Why would Beatrice Kensington care about projecting stability to a row of bank executives at her son's wedding? I tilted my head slightly, feigning naive curiosity. "It is lovely that your mother's friends could make it." Stephanie snorted, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Friends. Please, they are not friends. They are the underwriters. They needed to see Harrison looking like a grounded, successful family man before they sign off on the paperwork. Harrison's massive commercial loan approval is happening next week, $500,000. Once that clears, all our temporary cash flow issues will vanish, and we will finally be back on top where we belong. And you, my dear new sister, played your part perfectly to secure it." The words hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. A massive commercial loan approval next week, $500,000. The air in the room suddenly felt dangerously thin. My professional auditing mind, honed by years of forensic accounting, instantly seized upon the glaring, impossible discrepancy in her statement. Harrison Kensington could not secure a $500,000 commercial loan. It was a mathematical and financial impossibility. I knew his business inside and out. He ran a boutique corporate consulting firm that had been bleeding capital for the past 3 quarters. His debt-to-income ratio was abysmal. He had maxed out 2 personal credit cards just to keep his office lease afloat. I knew this because I had secretly helped him balance his ledgers 3 months ago. He had no hard assets. He had no collateral. The Kensington family estate was heavily mortgaged, and their trust fund had dried up years ago due to Beatrice's reckless spending habits. No underwriter at First National Bank or any bank in the country would ever approve a $500,000 commercial loan for a man with a collapsing business and a toxic credit score. It defied every fundamental rule of commercial lending. Unless, the word echoed in my mind cold and sharp as a scalpel, unless Harrison was not the one guaranteeing the loan. My brain raced through the variables, cross-referencing Stephanie's arrogant boast with the brutal prenuptial agreement Beatrice had just forced me to sign. Why the sudden aggressive demand for a prenup 45 minutes before the ceremony? Why invite the bank executives to the wedding? Why the desperate need to project absolute stability right before a major loan approval? The puzzle pieces slammed together with terrifying, undeniable clarity. They did not just want my current savings. My savings were already gone drained to pay for the white roses and the Wagyu beef. They were after my credit. I had a flawless credit score. I had zero debt. I had a decade of high-earning employment history at a top-tier financial firm, and most importantly, in exactly 2 weeks upon my 35th birthday, my late grandfather's sizable trust fund would become fully vested and legally accessible to me. A sickening wave of absolute horror washed over me as the full scope of their criminal conspiracy came into focus. Harrison and his mother had not just tricked me into paying for a wedding, they had not just manipulated me into signing away my marital rights. They were actively using my pristine financial standing to illegally secure a massive commercial loan. They had to be using my name, my credentials, and my future trust fund as the primary collateral to satisfy the bank's underwriting requirements. They were committing outright premeditated identity theft and financial fraud, and they were using this highly publicized wedding to legally bind me to their debt. If I walked out there and said, "I do," if I allowed this marriage to be legally recognized by the state, my assets would be irrevocably tied to Harrison's fraudulent enterprise. I would be legally responsible for $500,000 of stolen money. They were going to take the loan, funnel the cash into their failing estate, and leave me holding the bag. The sheer magnitude of their depravity was breathtaking. The man who had kissed my forehead this morning, the man who had whispered that I was the love of his life, had been actively forging my signature on federal banking documents while I picked out napkin rings and tasted wedding cake. The betrayal was so profound, so flawlessly executed, that it bypassed sorrow entirely and manifested as a chilling, calculating calm. My tear ducts dried up instantly. The frantic beating of my heart slowed to a methodical, predatory rhythm. I looked at Stephanie, who was still standing there smirking at me, completely unaware that her alcohol-fueled arrogance had just handed a master auditor the exact thread needed to unravel their entire criminal empire. She thought she had just delivered the ultimate insult to a defeated bride. She did not realize she had just handed me the murder weapon. I forced my facial muscles to remain entirely relaxed. I let my eyes widen slightly, projecting the image of a dim-witted, submissive woman who simply did not understand the complex world of high finance. "That is amazing news about the commercial loan, Stephanie." I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "I know Harrison has been working so incredibly hard on his consulting business. I'm so glad the bank is finally recognizing his brilliant vision. I'm sure those executives in the third row are going to be very impressed by the ceremony today." Stephanie rolled her eyes, clearly bored by my apparent stupidity. She took one last long sip of her champagne and set the empty crystal flute down on the mahogany table with a sharp clink. "Whatever, Olivia. Just do not trip on your veil when the music starts. My mother wants this to look perfect. Try to at least act like you belong here." She turned on her designer heel and marched toward the heavy oak door. She pulled it open, allowing the swelling chords of the church organ to flood into the small stone room before stepping out and letting the door click shut behind her. The moment I was completely alone, the naive, polite mask melted off my face like wax over an open flame. The air in the bridal suite felt charged with electricity. My mind was no longer focused on the wedding dress, the flowers, or the 300 guests waiting in the sanctuary. I was entirely focused on the digital trail of a $500,000 commercial loan. Harrison and Beatrice thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought they had legally trapped me in a cage of my own making. But they had made the fatal mistake of letting a senior financial auditor anywhere near their books. I did not need to cry. I needed data. I needed proof. I turned my back to the antique mirror, my eyes locking onto the small leather tote bag resting on the velvet armchair in the corner of the room. My company-issued laptop was inside. The time for playing the dutiful bride was over. It was time to initiate a full hostile audit. I stood in the center of the bridal suite, listening to the sharp click of the door closing behind Stephanie. The heavy silence of the room returned pressing against my ears. I took a slow, deliberate breath. The air felt thick with the sickening scent of the expensive floral arrangements I had paid for. My hands were no longer shaking. The tears that had threatened to spill just moments ago were completely gone. In their place was a profound, chilling clarity that settled over my mind like a fresh blanket of snow. I was not a helpless bride waiting to be slaughtered at the altar. I was a senior financial auditor. My entire career was built on dismantling liars and exposing fraud, and right now I was standing in the middle of the most elaborate financial scam of my life. I turned away from the antique vanity mirror. I did not look at my custom silk wedding gown. I did not look at the perfect veil cascading down my back. I walked straight to the heavy oak door of the suite and turned the brass deadbolt with a loud, decisive snap. I needed absolute privacy. I grabbed my leather tote bag from the velvet armchair and walked directly into the attached bridal bathroom. I locked that door too. The bathroom was vast and cold, lined with white marble that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent vanity lights. It was the perfect sterile environment for an audit. I set my tote bag on the pristine marble counter and pulled out my company-issued laptop. It was heavy and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the delicate lace of my sleeves. I flipped the screen open. The soft blue glow illuminated my face in the mirror. I looked like a ghost, but my eyes were burning with a fierce, calculating intensity. I connected to the secure cellular hotspot I always carried for emergency client audits. The network established a connection within seconds. While the security protocols loaded, my mind began to automatically categorize every strange interaction, every delayed payment, and every invasive question from the past 5 years. I remembered how Harrison had casually asked for my social security number 3 months ago, claiming his accountant needed it to set up our joint tax profiles before the wedding. I remembered how Beatrice had cornered me at a family dinner, asking incredibly specific, probing questions about the exact vesting date of my late grandfather's trust fund. At the time, I thought she was just being a typical nosy high society matriarch trying to gauge my worth. Now I realized she was conducting a ruthless financial appraisal of her target. They had been underwriting me. They had been calculating my exact net worth to see how much debt my pristine credit score could absorb. I opened my encrypted corporate database. As a senior auditor for a top-tier Manhattan firm, I had high-level clearance to access federal and state commercial registries, public tax filings, and corporate lending databases. It was a tool designed to track down hidden assets and verify liabilities for massive corporate mergers. Today, I was using it to dissect the man I was supposed to marry in less than 30 minutes. My fingers flew across the keyboard, striking the keys with rapid, aggressive precision. The rhythmic clicking echoed off the marble walls, drowning out the faint, muffled sounds of the church organ playing in the sanctuary. I started with the basics. I typed in Harrison Kensington. The search engine spun for a fraction of a second before flooding the screen with public records. I bypassed his personal credit history because I already knew it was a carefully constructed facade. Instead, I narrowed my search parameters to commercial entities registered in the state within the last 12 months. A single result populated the screen: Kensington Global Consulting, LLC. The registration date was exactly 4 months ago. That was the exact same week Harrison had proposed to me. The timing was not a coincidence. It was the foundation of his scam. I clicked on the corporate profile. The business was registered to a small post office box in a strip mall. It had no physical office space, no registered employees, and absolutely no documented revenue streams. It was a classic shell company, a phantom entity created for one single purpose: to receive and funnel large sums of money without raising immediate red flags. But a shell company with no revenue cannot secure a massive commercial loan on its own. It needs a massive influx of collateral. It needs a guarantor with flawless credit and guaranteed future liquidity. It needs me. I navigated to the State Commercial Lending Registry, a database that tracks large-scale corporate debt applications. I entered the tax identification number for Kensington Global Consulting, LLC. I held my breath. My chest tightened as a loading bar appeared on the screen. The blue line crawled across the white background. Every second felt like an eternity. I could hear the faint sound of guests taking their seats in the church pews just a few walls away. They were gathering to witness a celebration of love. They had no idea they were attending the closing ceremony of a financial crime. The screen flashed. A highly detailed 50-page commercial loan application materialized before my eyes. The lending institution was First National Bank. The exact same bank whose senior executives Beatrice had proudly invited to sit in the third row of the church today. The pieces of the puzzle were slamming together with brutal, devastating force. I scrolled down to the principal loan details. The requested amount stared back at me in bold black font. $500,000, $500,000. The numbers seemed to burn themselves into my retinas. My stomach churned violently, and a wave of pure physical nausea washed over me. I gripped the edge of the cold marble counter to steady myself. Harrison was applying for a $500,000 commercial loan through a shell company with zero assets. But the true horror was waiting on page 12. I scrolled down to the guarantor section of the application. The primary applicant was listed as Harrison Kensington, but his name alone was entirely insufficient to secure a loan of that magnitude. The bank required a secondary guarantor, a TO signer who would bear the absolute legal responsibility for the entire $500,000 debt if the primary applicant defaulted. There it was. My name, Olivia Ann Miller. My social security number was typed flawlessly into the identification field. My exact annual salary as a senior auditor was listed perfectly, and right below my current assets, there was a detailed legally binding disclosure regarding my late grandfather's trust fund. The application stated explicitly that the trust fund, which was set to vest fully on my 35th birthday in exactly 2 weeks, would be used as the primary collateral to secure the loan. They had weaponized my entire financial existence. Every late night I spent studying for my certification, every promotion I earned, every penny my grandfather had carefully saved for my future. They had taken all of it and packaged it into a fraudulent application to bail out their bankrupt lives. I scrolled to the very bottom of the page to the final signature line. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My signature was there. It was a highly sophisticated digital forgery, but it was undeniably crafted to look exactly like my handwriting. Harrison had taken one of the blank checks I had left on his kitchen counter to pay for the florist, traced my signature, and digitized it. He had committed outright premeditated federal wire fraud and identity theft. The sheer unadulterated evil of his plan was breathtaking. The loan application was currently listed in a pending approval status. It was waiting for one final piece of documentation to trigger the release of funds. It was waiting for a legally binding marriage certificate. The prenuptial agreement Beatrice had shoved in my face suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. It was not a document designed to protect their wealth. It was a document designed to establish a legally recognized financial merger between Harrison and me, while simultaneously stripping me of any power to defend myself. By signing that prenup and walking down the aisle to say I do, I would be legally validating our partnership. The moment the state recognized me as his wife, the bank would push the $500,000 loan through to final approval. The loan officers sitting in the third row were waiting to see the happy, stable couple before they released the funds on Monday morning. If I walked out there and completed this wedding, I would be shackled to a $500,000 debt. Harrison would take the money and funnel it directly into his shell company. He would use it to pay off the mounting debts of the Kensington estate. He would drain the funds dry. And because of the ruthless penalty clauses hidden inside that 40-page prenuptial agreement, I would be left with absolutely nothing. If I tried to divorce him after discovering the debt, the prenup dictated that I waived all rights to any shared assets. I would be legally responsible for paying back the $500,000 out of my own trust fund, while he walked away completely untouched. I opened a new tab and ran a rapid asset search on Beatrice Kensington and the entire Kensington family estate. I needed to know exactly how deep their financial grave really was. The results were a bloodbath of red ink. The sprawling historic mansion they loved to brag about was drowning in 3 separate mortgages. They had defaulted on their property taxes for the last 2 consecutive years. Beatrice's personal bank accounts were completely leveraged against high-interest credit lines. The great Kensington family, the high society aristocrats who had looked down their noses at my parents, were utterly, definitively, and irreparably bankrupt. They were broke. They were drowning in millions of dollars of debt, and they had targeted me as their personal life raft. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was pale, but her posture was rigid with a terrifying strength. I had spent the last 5 years trying to prove I was worthy of their family. I had paid for everything. I had funded the $84,000 wedding out of my own pocket because Harrison claimed his accounts were temporarily frozen, pending an investment transfer. I had bought the flowers, the food, the music, and the very dress I was standing in. I had paid for the privilege of being their sacrificial lamb. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my throat, echoing loudly in the sterile marble bathroom. It was not a laugh of sorrow. It was the laugh of a woman who had just realized she held the power of absolute destruction in the palm of her hand. Harrison thought I was a naive, easily manipulated woman, blinded by love. Beatrice thought I was a desperate social climber who would submit to any humiliation just to wear the Kensington name. They thought my middle-class upbringing made me weak. They had severely underestimated the psychological fortitude required to become a senior corporate auditor. I did not crumble under pressure. I thrived in it. I dismantled complex financial crimes for a living. I ripped apart fraudulent ledgers and sent arrogant executives to federal prison. And now, the most arrogant executives of all had invited me to their own execution. I did not need to run. I did not need to climb out a window or cancel the wedding. Canceling the wedding would only allow them to hide in the shadows. They would spin a story about how I was emotionally unstable or caught cheating. They would preserve their fake aristocratic reputation and continue looking for another victim to scam. I could not allow that. I had to let them think their plan was working flawlessly. I had to let Harrison stand at the altar feeling victorious. I had to let Beatrice sit in the front pew surrounded by her wealthy friends and the bank executives believing she had successfully secured her family's bailout. I carefully saved every single page of the fraudulent loan application. I downloaded the digital logs proving the signature was forged. I compiled the asset searches detailing the Kensington family's total bankruptcy. I organized everything into a single pristine digital file folder on my desktop. I named the folder the Kensington Audit. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The suffocating pain of heartbreak had been entirely burned away by a cold, brilliant fire of vengeance. I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk wedding gown and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. I plugged it into the side of my laptop. I transferred every single document, every piece of damning, undeniable evidence directly onto the drive. I unplugged the drive and held it tightly in my fist, the cold metal pressed against my palm, a physical reminder of my power. The church organ outside swelled into a triumphant, majestic chord, signaling that the guests were fully seated. The trap was perfectly laid. The naive bride was gone forever, but the auditor was ready to walk down the aisle. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, the digital proof of my own financial execution reflecting in my eyes. I had found the forged $500,000 commercial loan application, but as a senior auditor, I knew the application was only half the crime. To truly understand a financial conspiracy, you have to follow the money. You have to find the disbursement schedule. I navigated away from the guarantor page, my fingers striking the keys with a heavy, rhythmic intensity. The marble bathroom around me felt like a freezer, but my blood was boiling. I opened the loan's payout directives. When a bank approves a commercial loan of this magnitude, the funds do not just sit in a holding account. They are immediately routed to specific payees to cover the supposed business operations of the applicant. I scanned the routing numbers, expecting to see a list of Kensington family creditors or mortgage lenders. Instead, my eyes locked onto a scheduled monthly wire transfer that defied all logical business sense. It was an automatic recurring payment set up for $12,500 a month. The beneficiary was not a corporate entity or a vendor. It was a luxury property management firm located in downtown Boston. I frowned, leaning closer to the screen. Why would a boutique consulting firm in Connecticut need to wire $12,000 a month to a residential management group in Massachusetts? I copied the management firm's business identification number and opened a new tab. I logged into a state real estate database, a tool I frequently used to track down hidden assets during corporate bankruptcies. I pasted the number and hit search. The results loaded instantly, displaying a portfolio of ultra-high-end residential properties in the affluent Back Bay neighborhood. I matched the specific account number from Harrison's loan disbursement schedule to a particular lease agreement. The property was a penthouse apartment overlooking the Charles River. It featured 3 bedrooms, private elevator access, and a concierge service. It was the kind of opulent, excessive real estate that only the incredibly wealthy could afford. And Harrison was planning to pay for it using a fraudulent loan secured by my personal trust fund. My stomach churned, twisting into a tight, painful knot. I needed to know who was living in that penthouse. I needed to know exactly who I was supposed to be subsidizing with my grandfather's hard-earned money. I pulled up the tenant registration record for the penthouse unit. The name printed on the digital lease agreement felt like a physical blow to my chest. Chloe Harding. I stared at the name, my mind refusing to accept the reality of what I was reading. Chloe Harding. That was the name of our wedding planner. She was the bubbly, enthusiastic event coordinator Harrison had insisted on hiring 6 months ago. He had claimed she was a brilliant up-and-coming planner who operated remotely out of Boston, handling high-end clients across the East Coast. I had spent hours on the phone with her, discussing floral arrangements, cake tastings, and seating charts. I had trusted her with the most intimate details of my wedding day. I had wired her thousands of dollars from my own savings account to cover supposed vendor deposits. And now, the state registry was showing me that Chloe Harding was the sole tenant of a luxury penthouse that my future husband was planning to finance with $500,000 of stolen money. The sheer audacity of the lie was staggering. My hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a toxic, overwhelming wave of betrayal. I turned away from the laptop and grabbed Harrison's iPad from where I had hidden it inside my tote bag. I unlocked the screen, my thumb slipping slightly on the smooth glass. I opened his synced messages application. My heart was hammering a violent, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I typed the name Chloe into the search bar. I fully expected to see conversations about seating arrangements and catering menus. Instead, the search results yielded a continuous daily stream of messages, stretching back over a year. Long before we had even started planning the wedding. Long before Harrison had ever introduced her to me as our event coordinator. I clicked on the most recent thread, my eyes scanning the blue and gray bubbles. The words on the screen were so toxic, so deeply personal, they made the air in the bathroom feel too thick to breathe. "Good morning, my love," Chloe had written just 2 days ago. I went to the designer boutique on Newbury Street today and ordered the custom nursery furniture. It is going to look absolutely perfect in the penthouse. I put the deposit on the card you gave me. Harrison had replied less than 5 minutes later. "Anything for you, beautiful. Do not worry about the budget. Just get whatever you want. Once this ridiculous wedding charade is over and the bank clears the commercial loan on Monday, we will have more than enough cash to cover the rest of the lease and furnish the entire apartment. I cannot wait to come home to you." I read the messages again, the syllables burning themselves into my brain. This ridiculous wedding charade. He was talking about our wedding. He was talking about the day I had dreamed of, the day my parents had driven 16 hours to attend, the day I had funded with $84,000 of my own money. To him, it was nothing but a calculated financial transaction, a theatrical performance designed to pacify the bank executive sitting in the third row. He was using our marriage as a smokescreen to secure a $500,000 loan, and he was taking that money straight to Boston to build a life with another woman. I scrolled up, my fingers numb and clumsy. The messages grew increasingly intimate, increasingly sick. They talked about the vacations they would take once my trust fund was fully liquidated. They joked about how gullible I was, how eagerly I had offered to pay for the white roses and the Wagyu beef catering because I wanted to prove I was an independent woman. They laughed at my expense, sharing inside jokes about my modest Ohio upbringing and my dedication to my career. Beatrice was in on it too. In a group text between Harrison Chloe and his mother, Beatrice had explicitly praised Chloe for her patience, calling her the true future of the Kensington family, and referring to me as nothing more than a temporary financial inconvenience. But the absolute soul-crushing climax of their betrayal was buried in a message sent just last night. I stared at a photo Chloe had sent to Harrison. It was an ultrasound image, a black and white scan of a fully formed baby. Below the image, her text read, "The baby is kicking so much tonight, Harrison. The doctor said he is growing perfectly. I cannot believe I am already 5 months along. Our little boy is going to be so handsome, just like his daddy." 5 months along. The math hit me with the devastating force of a physical assault. 5 months ago was the exact time Harrison had proposed to me. He had gotten down on one knee in Central Park, presented me with a diamond ring I now realized was likely purchased on credit, and asked me to spend the rest of my life with him. He had looked me directly in the eyes and promised me a future filled with love and loyalty. And he had done it while his mistress was actively carrying his unborn child. Harrison replied to the ultrasound photo with a string of heart emojis. "He is perfect, Chloe. I love you both so much. Just hang in there for 48 more hours. I have to play the dutiful groom tomorrow and get Olivia to sign the prenuptial agreement. My mother made sure the penalty clauses will trap her completely. Once she says I do, the bank underwriters will finalize the loan. I will route the first $50,000 directly to your account by Tuesday. We are going to have everything we ever wanted, and the gold digger is going to foot the bill." I dropped the iPad onto the marble counter. The clatter of the metal casing echoed sharply in the silent bathroom. I gripped the edges of the sink, leaning forward until my forehead nearly touched the cold mirror. The nausea I had felt earlier was entirely gone. The crushing, suffocating sorrow of a broken heart had completely evaporated. I did not feel sad. I did not feel the urge to cry. Crying was a reaction for victims, for women who had been defeated by their circumstances. I was not a victim. I was a senior financial auditor, and I had just uncovered the largest, most personal fraud scheme of my entire life. I stared into my own eyes in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. The naive, hopeful bride who had spent the morning worrying about floral arrangements and seating charts was dead. She had been murdered by a 40-page prenuptial agreement, a forged commercial loan application, and a text thread filled with absolute poison. In her place stood a woman forged in ice and calculation. Every single interaction over the past 5 years, replayed in my mind, tinted with the ugly, undeniable truth. I remembered Harrison telling me he wanted to handle the vendor payments to alleviate my stress, only to later claim his accounts were tied up in complex investments. I'd willingly transferred thousands of dollars to cover the venue, the catering, the string quartet, believing I was simply supporting my future husband through a temporary cash flow issue. I had been paying for the very rope they planned to hang me with. I had been paying the salary of the woman who was carrying his child. Chloe had smiled at me over video calls, offering suggestions for my bridal bouquet while sleeping with my fiancé and decorating a luxury nursery with my stolen money. And Beatrice Kensington with her pearls and her fake aristocratic sneer. She had looked me in the eye just 30 minutes ago and called me a gold digger. She had threatened to publicly humiliate my hardworking parents, using my love for them to force my compliance. She thought she was a master manipulator. She thought she could use her wealthy friends and the bank executive sitting in the pews to intimidate a middle-class accountant from Ohio. She thought her family was untouchable. They had built a house of cards propped up entirely by my credit score and my grandfather's trust fund. They had carefully orchestrated this wedding day to be the grand finale of their scam. They wanted me to walk out into that sanctuary stand before a priest and 300 guests and legally shackle myself to $500,000 of fraudulent debt. They expected me to smile to say my vows and to blindly walk into a financial slaughterhouse so they could fund a luxury life in Boston. The absolute arrogance of their plan was matched only by its sheer stupidity. They had invited a woman who dismantled corporate fraud for a living into the inner sanctum of their financial crimes. They had handed me the very tools I needed to destroy them. I did not feel a shred of mercy. The lingering affection I had held for Harrison was violently severed, replaced by a cold, methodical desire for total, undeniable destruction. I wanted to see them burn. I wanted to watch the smug, aristocratic mask melt off Beatrice's face in front of the very society friends she desperately wanted to impress. I wanted Harrison to feel the exact moment his fake high society world collapsed into federal criminal charges. I wanted to ensure that the Kensington family name became synonymous with absolute ruin. I picked up my phone from the counter. I opened my banking application and downloaded the complete itemized transaction history of every single payment I had made for this wedding. $84,000 in total. Every wire transfer to the caterer, every credit card swipe for the florist, every single payment made to Chloe Harding for her event planning services. I saved the files into a secure folder. Then I transferred the screenshots of Harrison's text messages, the photos of the ultrasound, and the detailed records of the forged $500,000 loan application. I compiled every piece of damning evidence into a master presentation. I was not going to run away. I was not going to hide in this bathroom and cry while they spun a narrative to their wealthy friends about a bride with cold feet. Running away would only leave the door open for them to access the loan. Running away would let them keep their dignity. I wanted to take everything from them, just as they had planned to take everything from me. I was going to give them exactly the wedding they had paid for, which was to say, I was going to give them nothing, but I was going to give them the exact presentation they deserved. The conflict had reached its absolute peak. My sorrow was gone. Only the cold, brilliant fire of vengeance remained burning with a steady, lethal intensity. I sat in the sterile silence of the bridal bathroom, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The tears that had threatened to spill just moments ago were completely gone. The agonizing pain of heartbreak, the suffocating realization that the man I loved was a monster, had evaporated. In its place, a glacial, absolute calm washed over me. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of hairspray and expensive white lilies that permeated the suite. Crying was a luxury for victims. Crying was a reaction for women who had been defeated by their circumstances. I was not a victim. I was a senior corporate auditor. My entire career was built on dismantling liars, exposing fraud, and tearing down the arrogant facades of corrupt executives. And right now, I was sitting on the absolute motherlode of financial crimes. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a hysterical scene. If I walked out into the sanctuary right now, screaming and crying in my custom silk gown, the Kensington family would effortlessly spin the narrative. Beatrice would whisper to her wealthy friends that I was emotionally unstable. Harrison would play the heartbroken, beleaguered groom. They would paint me as a crazy, paranoid woman suffering from a bridal breakdown. They would preserve their fake aristocratic reputation and continue their search for another naive victim to scam. I could not allow that. I had to strike with cold, undeniable precision. I needed to use the law. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady and resolute. I bypassed my contacts list and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was the direct private line of attorney Richard Hayes. Richard was not just a seasoned corporate lawyer. He was a ruthless legal shark who ran one of the most feared litigation firms in Manhattan. He was also my mentor, the man who had guided my career since I was a junior associate, and a man who treated me like a daughter. He was supposed to be arriving at the church reception later, but I needed his lethal expertise right now. The phone rang twice before his deep, gravelly voice answered. "Olivia," he said warmly, "tell me you are calling to say you are running late, because if you are getting cold feet, I will personally come down there and drag you to the altar. Richard." I said, my voice eerily flat and devoid of any wedding day joy. "I need you to open your secure terminal immediately. I am sending you an encrypted data drop." There was a fraction of a second of silence on the line. Richard possessed an incredibly sharp instinct. He heard the shift in my tone, the absolute absence of emotion, and the professional vocabulary. The warm, fatherly wedding guest vanished instantly, replaced by the apex predator of corporate law. "I am at my desk. Terminal is open," he replied, his voice dropping into a low, serious register. "Talk to me, Olivia. What exactly are we looking at?" "I am looking at a $500,000 commercial loan application filed with First National Bank." I stated, my fingers flying across my laptop keyboard as I compressed the fraudulent documents into a secure file. The primary applicant is a newly formed shell company owned by Harrison. The secondary guarantor is me. The application is entirely fraudulent. Harrison forged my digital signature and listed my grandfather's trust fund as the primary collateral. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the speaker. "He forged your signature on a federal banking document." Richard asked, his tone laced with a terrifying, suppressed anger. "Yes," I replied smoothly. "But that is only the beginning. The Kensington estate is completely bankrupt. They are drowning in 3 defaulted mortgages. They are using this wedding today to legally bind me to Harrison, so the bank will release the loan funds on Monday morning. And the disbursement schedule proves the money is not even going to his fake business. It is being wired directly to a luxury penthouse lease in downtown Boston. The tenant of that penthouse is Chloe Harding, our wedding planner. She is currently 5 months pregnant with his child." The silence that followed was absolute. I hit the send key, watching the progress bar as the encrypted file flew through the digital space to Richard's terminal in New York. "File received." Richard finally said, the clicking of his own keyboard echoing through the phone. "I am opening it now." "Olivia, this is not just civil fraud. This is felony wire fraud, identity theft, and extortion. This is a federal crime." "I am looking at the signature logs right now. They are sloppy. They left a massive digital footprint." "Where are you right now?" "I am locked inside the bridal suite bathroom," I said. "The ceremony begins in exactly 20 minutes. Beatrice just forced a 40-page prenuptial agreement on me. She threatened to publicly humiliate my parents in front of the entire congregation if I do not sign it. It is packed with extreme penalty clauses designed to leave me destitute if I try to walk away after the loan clears. I heard Richard curse under his breath. "Do not walk out there, Olivia. Pack your things. I am calling the local authorities right now. I will have police cruisers at the church doors in 10 minutes. We will pull you and your parents out safely." "No," I countered, my voice firm and uncompromising. "I am not running away. If I run, they will bury this. They will withdraw the loan application and claim a misunderstanding. I want to burn their entire operation to the ground, and I want to do it in front of the very bank executives they invited to witness their glorious financial bailout. I need you to help me draft an emergency cease and desist, and I need a complete fraud packet prepared for the state authorities and the banking commission." I could hear Richard stop typing. A slow, dark chuckle rumbled through the phone line. He recognized the tone in my voice. He knew I was operating in pure boss energy. "You want to execute them at the altar," he said. "I want them to leave this church with absolutely nothing but criminal charges," I corrected. "Give me 15 minutes, Richard ordered, his voice sharp and energized. "I am drafting the cease and desist right now. I will prepare the formal fraud notifications for First National Bank's underwriting department. We will bury Harrison in so much legal red tape he will not be able to open a checking account for the rest of his life. But Olivia, you cannot sign that prenuptial agreement. If you sign it, you complicate the jurisdictional timeline." I smiled, a cold, empty movement of my lips. "Actually, Richard, I have to sign it. If I refuse to sign it, Beatrice will stop the wedding. I need to walk down that aisle to spring the trap. I am going to sign the prenup, but I am going to add a specific legal notation beneath my signature. I am going to cite the Uniform Commercial Code regarding duress and ongoing fraud investigations. It will physically secure her attempt at extortion while rendering the document legally void. You are weaponizing her own contract against her." Richard noted a deep sense of pride evident in his voice. "Brilliant. Make sure the notation is small enough to evade a quick visual scan, but clear enough for a judge to read. I am sending the legal drafts to your secure email now. Stay on the line." For the next 15 minutes, the bridal bathroom transformed into a high-level corporate war room. I downloaded the emergency legal documents Richard sent over, verifying the statutory citations and confirming the digital timestamps. We assembled an undeniable airtight fraud packet. It contained the IP addresses from Harrison's devices, the forged signature logs, the routing numbers to the Boston penthouse, the ultrasound photos, and the complete bankruptcy profile of the Kensington estate. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting and legal destruction. When the final document was secured, I disconnected the call with Richard. I packed my company laptop back into my leather tote bag and unlocked the bathroom door. I walked back into the main bridal suite. The heavy silence of the room was a stark contrast to the storm of activity I had just concluded. I walked over to the antique vanity table where the thick stack of the prenuptial agreement was waiting. It sat there like a poisonous snake waiting to strike. Beatrice thought this document was her ultimate victory. She thought she had outsmarted a middle-class accountant. I picked up the heavy silver pen. I flipped to the final signature page. I smoothed the heavy paper flat. I signed my name, Olivia Ann Miller, with bold, sweeping strokes. Then, with deliberate and microscopic precision, I added the specific legal addendum right beneath the final loop of my signature. I cited the exact federal statutes regarding documents signed under fraudulent duress. It was barely legible to the naked eye, looking like nothing more than an elaborate flourish of ink. But legally, it was a confession. By accepting this document, Beatrice and Harrison were unknowingly securing the physical proof of their own extortion attempt. It was the ultimate poisoned apple, and I was about to hand it directly to them. I set the pen down. The legal counterstrike was complete, but I was not finished. I did not just want them to face criminal charges in private. I wanted their public social annihilation. I wanted the bank executives, their wealthy friends, and my own parents to see exactly who the Kensingtons truly were. I remembered a conversation I had with Chloe, the pregnant mistress, posing as my event planner just 2 weeks ago. She had cheerfully informed me that the church possessed a state-of-the-art multimedia projector system integrated directly into the sanctuary walls and the reception hall. She had suggested we use it to display a romantic slideshow of childhood photos during the cocktail hour. Because I had paid for the entire audiovisual upgrade myself, I possessed the master administrative login and the network credentials. I pulled my smartphone from the hidden pocket of my silk wedding gown. I connected to the church's private audiovisual network, bypassing the standard guest Wi-Fi. My fingers moved with practice speed as I accessed the central broadcasting software. I opened a presentation application on my phone and began to build a very special wedding slideshow. I did not use photos of our first date or our engagement. I started with a high-resolution screenshot of the fraudulent $500,000 commercial loan application, highlighting my forged signature in a bright glowing red box. For the second slide, I uploaded the public tax records, proving the Kensington estate was facing imminent foreclosure accompanied by the notices of their defaulted mortgages. For the third slide, I uploaded the wire transfer schedule showing the stolen funds being routed directly to the luxury penthouse in Boston. And for the grand finale, I uploaded the text message thread between Harrison and Chloe. I selected the exact message where he called our wedding a ridiculous charade and bragged about using the gold digger to foot the bill. Right beside his words, I placed the black and white ultrasound photo of their unborn child. I reviewed the slideshow. It was devastating. It was a visual execution. I synchronized the presentation with the church's main projector system, ensuring it would display on the massive drop-down screens positioned directly above the altar. I set the broadcasting trigger to a remote one-touch activation on my phone. I slipped the phone back into the deep pocket of my gown. I stood up and smoothed the delicate lace of my bodice. I turned to the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was terrifyingly calm. My makeup was flawless. My hair was perfectly styled. I looked like a beautiful, innocent bride preparing to walk into her happily ever after. Nobody in that sanctuary had any idea that they were about to witness a massacre. A sharp knock sounded at the heavy oak door. It was time. The wedding planner called out asking if I was ready for the processional lineup. I picked up my bouquet of imported white roses, the very roses I had paid for, with my own money. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The bright light of the church corridor spilled into the room, accompanied by the swelling, majestic music of the string quartet. "I am completely ready," I said, my voice projecting a bright, artificial joy. I walked out of the bridal suite, my heels clicking softly against the stone floor. As I approached the vestibule, I saw Beatrice standing near the entrance to the sanctuary. She was wearing a stunning sapphire blue gown, her neck dripping in expensive diamonds that were likely purchased on credit. When she saw me, her sharp, angular face broke into a wide, triumphant smile. She thought she had won. She thought the middle-class accountant had finally submitted to her superior intellect. I walked directly up to her and handed her the signed prenuptial agreement. I made sure to look her straight in the pale blue eyes. "I signed exactly where you asked me to. Beatrice," I said, my tone perfectly submissive. "I just want Harrison to be happy." Beatrice snatched the document from my hands, her eyes gleaming with absolute victory. She did not even bother to check the signature page closely. She simply clutched it to her chest as if it were a winning lottery ticket. "You made the right choice, Olivia," she whispered, her voice dripping with condescension. "You are finally securing your place in this family. Now go out there and smile. We have very important guests watching." "I will not disappoint you," I replied softly. I turned away from her and took my place at the back of the sanctuary. Through the open double doors, I could see the massive vaulted ceiling of the historic church. The pews were packed with 300 guests. I saw my parents sitting in the very front row, my mother dabbing her eyes with a tissue, my father beaming with pride. I saw the row of sharply dressed bank executives from First National Bank, the men who held the keys to Harrison's fraudulent loan. And standing at the far end of the long white aisle waiting by the altar was Harrison. He looked incredibly handsome. He was smiling warmly at the guests, projecting the perfect image of a devoted, successful groom. He caught my eye across the vast distance and gave me a soft, reassuring nod. He thought the trap had closed around me. He thought he was about to secure his financial freedom and his secret family in Boston. The music shifted the heavy chords of the wedding march, echoing through the grand space. The guests rose to their feet, turning in unison to look at me. I gripped my bouquet of white roses tightly. My thumb rested gently against the smooth glass of the smartphone, hidden deep within the silk folds of my pocket. I took my first step down the aisle. The tactical maneuver was complete. It was time to burn the Kensington family to the ground. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary stood firmly shut before me, acting as a final barrier between my shattered past and my calculating future. The air in the vestibule was cool and smelled of polished stone and melting beeswax from the dozens of candles burning in the alcoves. The wedding planner, a young woman holding a clipboard and wearing a headset, gave me a tight, professional smile. She raised her hand, holding up 3 fingers, to count down the final seconds before the procession began. I stood perfectly still. My spine was straight and my shoulders were squared. I held my bouquet of imported white roses tightly in my hands, letting the smooth green stems press into my palms. I could hear the muffled shuffling of 300 guests taking their seats inside the grand historic church. They were whispering and settling in, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was about to unfold. I took a slow and measured breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs and steady my heart rate. The frantic, panicked heartbeat of a betrayed woman was entirely gone. In its place was the slow, methodical pulse of a senior financial auditor walking into a hostile corporate takeover. The wedding planner dropped her hand and gave a sharp nod to the ushers standing on either side of the entrance. The ushers pulled the heavy brass handles and the massive doors slowly swung open outward. A blinding wash of golden light spilled into the dim vestibule. The sudden brightness illuminated the intricate lace of my custom wedding gown and the sheer tulle of the veil draped over my face. At that exact moment, the church organist struck the first resonant chord of the traditional wedding march. The majestic swelling music echoed through the vaulted ceilings and bounced off the stained glass windows. It was a beautiful, sweeping sound that was meant to signal the beginning of a lifelong union of love and trust. To my ears, it sounded like the opening bell of a financial execution. I took my first step forward, letting the tip of my satin shoe cross the threshold into the sanctuary. The sheer weight of the silk gown dragged softly against the pristine white aisle runner. Every single face in the crowded church turned toward me in unison. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto my figure, watching me emerge from the shadows of the vestibule. I maintained the perfect, flawless illusion of a blushing, compliant bride. I lowered my chin slightly and allowed a soft, timid smile to touch my lips. I kept my gaze demure and focused just slightly downward, projecting the image of a woman overwhelmed by the beauty and emotion of the day. Inside my mind, however, I was a predator surveying a landscape of targets. I took another slow step, syncing my movements to the grand rhythm of the organ music. As I walked, I allowed my peripheral vision to take in the lavish decorations. I saw the towering arrangements of white hydrangeas and cascading orchids framing every single pew. I saw the hundreds of floating candles casting a warm, romantic glow over the aisles. I saw the intricate silk ribbons tying the programs together. My professional mind immediately categorized every single item with its exact dollar value. The flowers were $22,000. The custom aisle runner was $3,000. The string quartet playing softly in the background before the organ took over was $4,000. I had paid for every single detail. I had drained my personal savings account wiring $84,000 of my own hard-earned money to fund this spectacular illusion. Harrison had claimed his business accounts were temporarily frozen, and Beatrice had claimed the Kensington estate was liquidating assets for a better tax position. I had believed their lies because I loved him. Now, looking at the flowers I had bought to decorate my own financial slaughterhouse, I felt a cold, brilliant fire of vengeance burning in my chest. I continued my slow, measured walk down the long aisle. The guests were murmuring softly as I passed them. I heard faint whispers of admiration from the people sitting in the back rows. They thought I was the luckiest woman in the world, marrying into the prestigious, aristocratic Kensington family. They saw the custom tuxedo on the groom, the designer gowns on the bridesmaids, and the historic venue, and they assumed they were witnessing a merger of two powerful bloodlines. They did not know that the Kensington family was completely and utterly bankrupt. They did not know that the sprawling estate was drowning in 3 defaulted mortgages, or that Beatrice had maxed out her credit lines just to maintain appearances. They did not know that the beautiful, smiling bride walking past them was being used as a human shield to absorb $500,000 of fraudulent commercial debt. About halfway down this aisle, my eyes found my parents sitting in the very first pew on the left side of the church. My mother was clutching a lace handkerchief to her face, weeping genuine, heartfelt tears of joy. She looked so beautiful in her simple pastel dress. My father was standing tall beside her, his chest puffed out with absolute pride. He gave me a warm, trembling smile as our eyes met. My parents were hardworking, honest people who had farmed and saved their entire lives to give me a chance at a brilliant corporate career in the city. They had driven 16 hours from Ohio just to be here today. They loved Harrison because they thought he cherished me. They had no idea that the man waiting at the altar had forged my signature on federal banking documents, or that he was secretly funding a luxury penthouse in Boston for his pregnant mistress. Looking at my parents, a fierce, primal instinct surged through my veins. Harrison and Beatrice had tried to use my love for my family as a weapon. Just an hour ago in the bridal suite, Beatrice had threatened to stop the wedding and publicly humiliate my parents in front of this very crowd if I refused to sign their draconian prenuptial agreement. She had tried to hold my parents' dignity hostage to force me into signing away my financial rights. I promised myself in that exact moment that I would protect my family at all costs. I was not going to let the Kensington family make a fool of my father. I was not going to let them steal the trust fund my grandfather had spent 50 years building. I broke eye contact with my parents and directed my gaze across the aisle, locking onto the real targets of my operation. On the right side of the church, in the designated front rows, sat the Kensington family and their elite guests. In the very first pew sat Beatrice Kensington. She was wearing a stunning sapphire blue designer gown that cost more than my first car. Her neck was adorned with a heavy diamond necklace that was undoubtedly borrowed or purchased on a fraudulent credit line. As I approached, she did not look at me with the warmth of a welcoming mother-in-law. She looked at me with the smug, triumphant satisfaction of a predator who had successfully trapped her prey. She offered me a sharp, arrogant smirk, completely confident that her brutal extortion tactic in the bridal suite had worked flawlessly. She believed that the 40-page prenuptial agreement I had handed back to her was the ultimate legal leash securing my future assets for her family. She was utterly unaware that the microscopic legal addendum I had added beneath my signature completely invalidated the document under the statutes of fraud and duress. Sitting directly behind Beatrice in the second and third pews were 6 men wearing impeccably tailored charcoal suits. They stood out entirely from the rest of the wedding guests. They were not chatting or smiling. They were watching the ceremony with the cold, calculating eyes of corporate underwriters. These were the senior bank executives from First National Bank. Beatrice had specifically invited them to the wedding to project an image of absolute financial stability and dynastic wealth. They were the men holding the keys to the $500,000 commercial loan application that Harrison had submitted using a newly formed shell company. I kept my face perfectly serene as I walked past them, but my mind was rapidly processing the sheer audacity of their presence. These bank executives believed they were attending a social event to honor a valued client. They believed they were watching Harrison Kensington, a supposedly successful entrepreneur, marry a high-earning senior auditor with a massive impending trust fund. They were waiting to see the marriage legally finalized so they could rubber stamp the loan approval on Monday morning and release $500,000 into Harrison's fraudulent accounts. They had absolutely no idea that the primary guarantor signature on their federal lending application was a complete forgery traced from a stolen blank check. They had no idea that the woman walking past them in the white dress was currently holding a flash drive containing the exact digital evidence required to send their valued client to a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and identity theft. I took another step, the heavy silk of my dress rustling softly against the runner. Every step brought me closer to the altar and closer to the absolute peak of this conflict. I shifted my gaze away from the bank executives and finally looked directly at the man standing at the end of the aisle. Harrison looked like a flawless prince, plucked directly from a fairy tale. He was standing perfectly straight, his hands clasped respectfully in front of him. The soft, golden light from the stained glass window illuminated his handsome features. As I drew nearer, I could see that he had actually managed to conjure tears in his eyes. A single perfect teardrop rolled down his cheek, catching the light as it fell. It was a masterful, breathtaking performance. He was playing the role of the overwhelmed, deeply in love groom to absolute perfection. Any other woman would have melted at the sight of him. Any other woman would have seen those tears and felt a rush of overwhelming validation and romance. But I was not any other woman, and I was no longer blinded by the illusion of our 5-year relationship. When I looked at Harrison crying at the altar, I did not see love. I saw a man who had texted his pregnant mistress just 12 hours ago, calling this entire wedding a ridiculous charade. I saw a man who had laughed with his event planner about using the gullible gold digger to foot the bill for their luxury penthouse in Boston. I saw a man who was willing to destroy my entire financial future, saddle me with $500,000 of fraudulent debt, and leave me destitute just to save his own miserable, bankrupt family from foreclosure. I maintained my soft, timid smile, projecting total submission as I closed the final distance between us. I reached the bottom of the altar steps. The organ music swelled to a magnificent climax, filling the entire church with a deafening, triumphant sound before slowly fading away into a reverent, breathless silence. The priest standing behind the altar offered us a warm, welcoming smile, ready to begin the sacred ceremony. I turned slightly and handed my heavy bouquet of imported white roses to my maid of honor. She gave my arm a gentle, reassuring squeeze, completely oblivious to the cold digital weapon resting in the hidden pocket of my gown just inches from her hand. I turned back to face Harrison and took the final step up to the altar. He immediately reached out and took both of my hands in his. His palms were warm and his grip was strong and deeply reassuring. He leaned forward slightly, gazing down at me with an expression of profound manufactured devotion. "You look absolutely perfect," he whispered, his voice husky and filled with fake emotion. "I am the luckiest man in the world." I looked up at him through the sheer fabric of my veil. I let the facade of the blushing, compliant bride completely fall away. I did not smile. I did not blink. I looked him dead in the eye with a gaze so entirely devoid of warmth, so completely glacial and calculating that I felt him physically flinch. The confident, arrogant smile on his handsome face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a sudden microscopic flash of genuine confusion. He squeezed my hands a little tighter, trying to silently prompt me back into character, but I remained perfectly still. My right hand, resting lightly in his left grip, subtly shifted. My thumb brushed against the smooth silk of my hidden pocket, tracing the outline of the smartphone resting securely inside. The phone was already connected to the church multimedia network. The presentation was loaded on the master projector screens hidden in the ceiling beams directly above us. The evidence of his forgery, his mistress, his bankruptcy, and his utter depravity was ready to be broadcast to every single person in the room. I took one final slow breath, feeling the absolute, undeniable power of holding his entire fraudulent world in my hands, fully prepared to press the button and detonate the bomb. The heavy air inside the sanctuary smelled of burning beeswax and imported white roses. I stood at the altar, holding the hands of the man who had plotted my absolute financial ruin. Harrison's palms were warm against my icy skin. He was looking down at me with an expression of manufactured adoration that was so flawless it could have won awards. To the 300 guests sitting behind us, we were the perfect picture of high society romance. The sunlight streamed through the massive stained glass windows, casting colorful beams of light across the stone floor and illuminating the intricate lace of my custom wedding gown. It was a gown I had paid for with my own hard-earned money. It was a gown I was wearing to my own execution, but the executioner was about to become the victim. The priest stood before us in his ornate vestments, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceilings of the historic church. He spoke of love, of trust, of building a life together in the eyes of the community. Every word he spoke felt like a cruel irony. I listened to his soothing tone while my mind calculated the exact sequence of events that was about to unfold. I did not blink. I did not let my smile falter. I kept my gaze locked softly on Harrison, allowing him to believe that his trap had successfully closed around me. He squeezed my hands gently, silently, encouraging me to play my part. I squeezed back a silent promise that he was about to get exactly what he deserved. Behind me, the congregation sat in reverent silence. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze. In the very front row sat my parents. My mother was wiping away tears of joy with a lace handkerchief, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal her only daughter had just uncovered. My father was sitting tall and proud, believing he was giving me away to a man who would cherish and protect me for the rest of my life. The fierce protective instinct burning in my chest gave me the strength to maintain my composure. I was doing this for them just as much as I was doing it for myself. I would not allow the Kensington family to make fools of the people who had sacrificed everything for my success. Across the aisle in the designated family pews sat Beatrice Kensington. I did not need to turn my head to know she was wearing a smug, triumphant smirk. She believed she had won. She believed the 40-page prenuptial agreement currently sitting in the bridal suite was her ultimate victory. She believed she had successfully extorted a middle-class accountant into securing her bankrupt family legacy. And right behind her sat the true audience of this grand performance. The senior executives from First National Bank were sitting in the third row, impeccably dressed and watching the ceremony with calculated interest. They were waiting to see Harrison legally bind himself to my pristine credit score and my impending trust fund. They were waiting for the absolute legal validation of a $500,000 commercial loan that had been forged using my stolen identity. They were the key to the Kensington family survival, and they were about to become the witnesses to their ultimate destruction. The priest raised his hands and asked the congregation to bow their heads in a brief moment of silent prayer. I used that precious minute to center myself. I cataloged the evidence waiting on the flash drive connected to my laptop in the back room. I went over the financial data, the forged signatures, the text messages, and the ultrasound photos proving Harrison was expecting a child with his mistress. My sorrow had been entirely consumed by a cold, brilliant fire of vengeance. I was a senior corporate auditor. I dismantled complex frauds for a living. I ripped apart falsified ledgers and exposed corrupt executives. Today, my target was the man standing right in front of me. The priest lowered his hands, and the church fell completely silent. The ambient noise of rustling fabric and polite coughing ceased entirely. The air grew thick with anticipation. It was time for the vows. The priest turned to Harrison and asked him to repeat the sacred promises. Harrison cleared his throat, his hazel eyes shining with fake sincerity. He spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring his voice carried to the bank executives in the third row. He promised to love me, to honor me, to cherish me in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. The audacity of his lies was breathtaking. He promised to share his life with me while actively plotting to steal my money and fund a luxury penthouse in Boston for another woman. I listened to his smooth, confident delivery and felt absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. He finished his vows, and the priest turned to me. The heavy silence of the sanctuary pressed against my eardrums. It was my turn. It was the moment I was supposed to pledge my life and my assets to a criminal. I looked at the priest, and then I looked deeply into Harrison's eyes. I let the soft, submissive smile fade from my lips. My face settled into a mask of pure, unadulterated professional authority. Harrison noticed the shift immediately. His confident posture stiffened. The fake warmth in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden microscopic flash of confusion and panic. He opened his mouth slightly to whisper something to me, to prompt me to speak my lines, but I did not give him the chance. I smoothly pulled my right hand out of his grip. I reached deep into the hidden silk pocket of my wedding gown, and my fingers found the smooth glass screen of my smartphone. I had already bypassed the security lock and left the presentation broadcasting application open. My thumb hovered over the activation button. I did not hesitate. I pressed it. The digital command shot through the church wireless network, instantly connecting to the state-of-the-art multimedia projector system I had personally funded for the reception. A loud mechanical hum suddenly echoed from the vaulted ceiling above the altar. The massive motorized projector screens, which were designed to remain hidden until the cocktail hour, began to slowly descend behind the priest. The sudden noise shattered the solemn silence of the ceremony. A wave of confusion rippled through the pews. I could hear the guests, shifting in their seats, murmuring questions to one another. The priest stepped back, looking up at the descending screens in total bewilderment. Harrison stared at me, his face draining of color. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, his charming facade cracking violently. I did not answer him. I simply took a step to the side, moving toward the microphone positioned on the altar podium. The massive white screens locked into place, and the high-definition projectors flared to life. The brilliant light cut through the dim, romantic atmosphere of the church. The guests leaned forward, expecting to see a heartwarming slideshow of childhood photos or romantic engagement pictures. They expected a touching tribute to our love story. Instead, the screens displayed something entirely different. The very first image was a massive, incredibly crisp scan of a catering invoice. It was a bill from the Ritz-Carlton for the 5-course Wagyu beef dinner, currently waiting in the reception hall. The total amount, highlighted in bright yellow, was $32,000. But the most important detail was the name listed under the payment section. The payment had been made in full by a direct wire transfer from my personal checking account. My name, Olivia Ann Miller, was displayed in massive bold letters for the entire congregation to see. Before the guests could even process the first document, the screen transitioned to the next slide. A receipt for the venue deposit appeared showing $12,000 paid by my credit card. Then a receipt for the imported floral arrangements showing $22,000 paid from my savings account. Then the string quartet, the open bar, the custom invitations, and the very dress Harrison's sister was wearing. Slide after slide of itemized financial records illuminated the church, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the prestigious Kensington family had not contributed a single penny to their own son's wedding. Every single receipt bore my name. The total calculation at the bottom of the final summary slide read $84,000. The sanctuary erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. The carefully constructed illusion of Kensington wealth was being systematically dismantled in high definition. I walked up to the microphone and adjusted it, pulling it close to my mouth. I looked down into the front row. Beatrice Kensington was frozen in her seat. The smug, triumphant smirk had been completely wiped off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her pale blue eyes were wide with panic as she stared up at the massive financial records exposing her family poverty to her elite social circle. I tapped the microphone once, and the sharp sound cut through the murmuring crowd, demanding absolute silence. I took a slow breath, letting my voice ring out clear, strong, and completely devoid of emotion. I want to take a moment to address our guests, I announced, my voice echoing off the stone walls. I want to specifically thank my future mother-in-law, Beatrice Kensington, for her overwhelming generosity today. The crowd fell deathly silent, hanging on my every word. Beatrice raised a trembling hand to her throat. I looked directly at the row of bank executives sitting just behind her. I want to thank Beatrice for allowing me the absolute honor of funding this entire $84,000 spectacle out of my own pocket. I continued, my tone laced with heavy, calculated sarcasm. I know how deeply the Kensington family values their aristocratic reputation, and I was more than happy to drain my middle-class savings account to ensure they could project an image of total financial stability to their important business partners today. A loud collective gasp swept through the church. The word broke, reverberated in the silence. The wealthy friends Beatrice had spent years impressing were now staring at her with open, naked shock and mounting contempt. The high society facade she had ruthlessly maintained was crumbling to ash right in front of them. The sheer public humiliation was absolute. I watched the bank executives in the third row physically react. The men in the charcoal suits stiffened their professional composure, breaking as they stared at the massive receipts on the screens. They were underwriters trained to spot financial instability. They were looking at concrete, undeniable proof that the family applying for a $500,000 commercial loan could not even afford to pay for their own event planner. I saw one of the senior executives lean over and whisper frantically to his colleague, his eyes darting between Beatrice and the financial records displayed above the altar. They were putting the pieces together. They were realizing that the Kensington estate was a hollow shell, and they were calculating the massive risk they had almost underwritten. Harrison lunged forward, trying to grab my arm, but I smoothly stepped out of his reach, keeping my position behind the podium. "Olivia, turn that off right now," he commanded, his voice tight with rising panic. "You are embarrassing us. You are ruining everything." I looked at him, my professional auditing mind locking onto his desperation. "I am not ruining anything, Harrison," I replied, high voice projecting clearly over the microphone for every single guest to hear. "I am simply providing full financial transparency to your investors. As a senior auditor, I believe in complete disclosure, especially when dealing with commercial lending." The mention of commercial lending sent a shockwave through the bank executives. They sat up straighter, their expressions turning from shock to intense forensic scrutiny. Beatrice let out a strangled cry, half rising from her pew before collapsing back down. The humiliation was so complete, so flawlessly executed, that it required no shouting and no tears. I had used cold, hard data to annihilate their social standing and their financial credibility in one swift, tactical maneuver. The $84,000 proof was only the beginning of my presentation. The first layer of their scam had been exposed, and the crowd was reeling from the impact. but I knew the true devastation was still waiting in my pocket. The conflict had reached its absolute peak. My sorrow was gone. Only the cold, brilliant fire of vengeance remained burning with a steady, lethal intensity as I prepared to trigger the next phase of the audit. I stood tall, bathed in the glow of the projector screens, ready to unleash the rest of the truth. The heavy air inside the sanctuary smelled of burning beeswax and imported white roses. I stood at the altar, holding the hands of the man who had plotted my absolute financial ruin. Harrison's palms were warm against my icy skin. He was looking down at me with an expression of manufactured adoration that was so flawless it could have won awards. To the 300 guests sitting behind us, we were the perfect picture of high society romance. The sunlight streamed through the massive stained glass windows, casting colorful beams of light across the stone floor and illuminating the intricate lace of my custom wedding gown. It was a gown I had paid for with my own hard-earned money. It was a gown I was wearing to my own execution, but the executioner was about to become the victim. The priest stood before us in his ornate vestments, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceilings of the historic church. He spoke of love of trust, of building a life together in the eyes of the community. Every word he spoke felt like a cruel irony. I listened to his soothing tone while my mind calculated the exact sequence of events that was about to unfold. I did not blink. I did not let my smile falter. I kept my gaze locked softly on Harrison, allowing him to believe that his trap had successfully closed around me. He squeezed my hands gently, silently, encouraging me to play my part. I squeezed back a silent promise that he was about to get exactly what he deserved. Behind me, the congregation sat in reverent silence. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze. In the very front row sat my parents. My mother was wiping away tears of joy with a lace handkerchief, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal her only daughter had just uncovered. My father was sitting tall and proud, believing he was giving me away to a man who would cherish and protect me for the rest of my life. The fierce protective instinct burning in my chest gave me the strength to maintain my composure. I was doing this for them just as much as I was doing it for myself. I would not allow the Kensington family to make fools of the people who had sacrificed everything for my success. Across the aisle in the designated family pews sat Beatrice Kensington. I did not need to turn my head to know she was wearing a smug, triumphant smirk. She believed she had won. She believed the 40-page prenuptial agreement currently sitting in the bridal suite was her ultimate victory. She believed she had successfully extorted a middle-class accountant into securing her bankrupt family legacy, and right behind her sat the true audience of this grand performance. The senior executives from First National Bank were sitting in the third row impeccably dressed and watching the ceremony with calculated interest. They were waiting to see Harrison legally bind himself to my pristine credit score and my impending trust fund. They were waiting for the absolute legal validation of a $500,000 commercial loan that had been forged using my stolen identity. They were the key to the Kensington family survival, and they were about to become the witnesses to their ultimate destruction. The priest raised his hands and asked the congregation to bow their heads in a brief moment of silent prayer. I used that precious minute to center myself. I cataloged the evidence waiting on the flash drive connected to my laptop in the back room. I went over the financial data, the forged signatures, the text messages, and the ultrasound photos proving Harrison was expecting a child with his mistress. My sorrow had been entirely consumed by a cold, brilliant fire of vengeance. I was a senior corporate auditor. I dismantled complex frauds for a living. I ripped apart falsified ledgers and exposed corrupt executives. Today, my target was the man standing right in front of me. The priest lowered his hands, and the church fell completely silent. The ambient noise of rustling fabric and polite coughing ceased entirely. The air grew thick with anticipation. It was time for the vows. The priest turned to Harrison and asked him to repeat the sacred promises. Harrison cleared his throat, his hazel eyes shining with fake sincerity. He spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring his voice carried to the bank executives in the third row. He promised to love me, to honor me, to cherish me in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. The audacity of his lies was breathtaking. He promised to share his life with me while actively plotting to steal my money and fund a luxury penthouse in Boston for another woman. I listened to his smooth, confident delivery and felt absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. He finished his vows, and the priest turned to me. The heavy silence of the sanctuary pressed against my eardrums. It was my turn. It was the moment I was supposed to pledge my life and my assets to a criminal. I looked at the priest, and then I looked deeply into Harrison's eyes. I let the soft, submissive smile fade from my lips. My face settled into a mask of pure, unadulterated professional authority. Harrison noticed the shift immediately. His confident posture stiffened. The fake warmth in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden microscopic flash of confusion and panic. He opened his mouth slightly to whisper something to me, to prompt me to speak my lines, but I did not give him the chance. I smoothly pulled my right hand out of his grip. I reached deep into the hidden silk pocket of my wedding gown, and my fingers found the smooth glass screen of my smartphone. I had already bypassed the security lock and left the presentation broadcasting application open. My thumb hovered over the activation button. I did not hesitate. I pressed it. The digital command shot through the church wireless network, instantly connecting to the state-of-the-art multimedia projector system I had personally funded for the reception. A loud mechanical hum suddenly echoed from the vaulted ceiling above the altar. The massive motorized projector screens, which were designed to remain hidden until the cocktail hour, began to slowly descend behind the priest. The sudden noise shattered the solemn silence of the ceremony. A wave of confusion rippled through the pews. I could hear the guests shifting in their seats, murmuring questions to one another. The priest stepped back, looking up at the descending screens in total bewilderment. Harrison stared at me, his face draining of color. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, his charming facade cracking violently. I did not answer him. I simply took a step to the side, moving toward the microphone positioned on the altar podium. The massive white screens locked into place, and the high-definition projectors flared to life. The brilliant light cut through the dim, romantic atmosphere of the church. The guests leaned forward, expecting to see a heartwarming slideshow of childhood photos or romantic engagement pictures. They expected a touching tribute to our love story. Instead, the screens displayed something entirely different. The very first image was a massive, incredibly crisp scan of a catering invoice. It was a bill from the Ritz-Carlton for the 5-course Wagyu beef dinner, currently waiting in the reception hall. The total amount highlighted in bright yellow was $32,000. But the most important detail was the name listed under the payment section. The payment had been made in full by a direct wire transfer from my personal checking account. My name, Olivia Ann Miller, was displayed in massive bold letters for the entire congregation to see. Before the guests could even process the first document, the screen transitioned to the next slide. A receipt for the venue deposit appeared, showing $12,000 paid by my credit card. Then a receipt for the imported floral arrangements, showing $22,000 paid from my savings account. Then the string quartet, the open bar, the custom invitations, and the very dress Harrison's sister was wearing. Slide after slide of itemized financial records illuminated the church, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the prestigious Kensington family had not contributed a single penny to their own son's wedding. Every single receipt bore my name. The total calculation at the bottom of the final summary slide read $84,000. The sanctuary erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. The carefully constructed illusion of Kensington wealth was being systematically dismantled in high definition. I walked up to the microphone and adjusted it, pulling it close to my mouth. I looked down into the front row. Beatrice Kensington was frozen in her seat. The smug, triumphant smirk had been completely wiped off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her pale blue eyes were wide with panic as she stared up at the massive financial records exposing her family poverty to her elite social circle. I tapped the microphone once, and the sharp sound cut through the murmuring crowd, demanding absolute silence. I took a slow breath, letting my voice ring out clear, strong, and completely devoid of emotion. "I want to take a moment to address our guests," I announced, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "I want to specifically thank my future mother-in-law, Beatrice Kensington, for her overwhelming generosity today." The crowd fell deathly silent, hanging on my every word. Beatrice raised a trembling hand to her throat. I looked directly at the row of bank executives sitting just behind her. "I want to thank Beatrice for allowing me the absolute honor of funding this entire $84,000 spectacle out of my own pocket." I continued, my tone laced with heavy, calculated sarcasm. "I know how deeply the Kensington family values their aristocratic reputation, and I was more than happy to drain my middle-class savings account to ensure they could project an image of total financial stability to their important business partners today." A loud collective gasp swept through the church. The word broke, reverberated in the silence. The wealthy friends Beatrice had spent years impressing were now staring at her with open, naked shock and mounting contempt. The high society facade she had ruthlessly maintained was crumbling to ash right in front of them. The sheer public humiliation was absolute. I watched the bank executives in the third row physically react. The men in the charcoal suits stiffened their professional composure, breaking as they stared at the massive receipts on the screens. They were underwriters trained to spot financial instability. They were looking at concrete, undeniable proof that the family applying for a $500,000 commercial loan could not even afford to pay for their own event planner. I saw one of the senior executives lean over and whisper frantically to his colleague, his eyes darting between Beatrice and the financial records displayed above the altar. They were putting the pieces together. They were realizing that the Kensington estate was a hollow shell, and they were calculating the massive risk they had almost underwritten. Harrison lunged forward, trying to grab my arm, but I smoothly stepped out of his reach, keeping my position behind the podium. "Olivia, turn that screen off right now," he commanded, his voice tight with rising panic. "You are embarrassing my family. You are having a breakdown. Someone cut the power." I did not even blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply pressed my thumb against the glass screen of my smartphone, still safely concealed in the deep hidden pocket of my dress. The massive high-definition screen suspended above the altar instantly flickered and transitioned to the next slide. The $84,000 wedding receipts vanished. In their place, a towering, crystal-clear image of a federal commercial loan application materialized. The bright white background of the banking document cast a harsh, unforgiving glare over the dimly lit sanctuary. The requested loan amount of $500,000 was highlighted in a brilliant glowing red box. But it was the bottom half of the document that caused the entire church to fall into an absolute breathless silence. The guarantor section was magnified, displaying my full legal name, my social security number, and the detailed breakdown of my late grandfather's trust fund. Right below that, magnified to 10 times its normal size, was the forged digital signature Harrison had traced from my stolen check. I leaned into the microphone. The metallic hum of feedback echoed through the vaulted ceilings, forcing every single guest to hang on my next words. "For those of you who do not know me well, my name is Olivia Miller," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clinical detachment. "I am a senior corporate auditor. I spend my days tracking down financial fraud." So you can imagine my profound professional surprise when I discovered that my future husband and his mother had secretly filed a fraudulent commercial loan application to bail out their foreclosed estate. They forged my signature to steal $500,000, using this beautiful wedding ceremony to legally bind me to their criminal debt. A collective gasp ripped through the pews, tearing through the suffocating scent of the imported white roses. The ambient murmur of the crowd instantly transformed into a chaotic symphony of disbelief and horror. I did not look at the wealthy socialites sitting in the back rows. I directed my gaze entirely to the third row on the right side of the church. I looked straight at the senior executives from First National Bank. The underwriters were no longer sitting back in their polished charcoal suits. They were leaning forward, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at the massive screens. They were looking at their own proprietary banking documents displayed in front of 300 witnesses. I saw the lead executive, a man with silver hair and a rigid posture, turn completely white. He recognized the application. He recognized the felony wire fraud playing out right in front of his face. He quickly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he desperately began typing a message to his legal compliance department. They realized they had almost underwritten a massive federal crime, and they realized the woman standing at the altar had just saved them from millions of dollars in liability. Harrison was completely trapped. He looked at the massive screens, then looked at the bank executives, and finally looked at me. His hazel eyes darted back and forth like a cornered animal. "Olivia, please," he begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic, fractured whisper. "We can fix this. I can explain everything. I was just trying to secure our future." "Do not do this to us. There is no us, Harrison," I replied smoothly. "There is only you, your bankrupt mother, and your pregnant event planner." I pressed the button on my phone one more time. The loan application dissolved into a collage of high-resolution text messages and financial wire transfers. On the left side of the screen, the monthly lease agreement for a luxury penthouse in downtown Boston appeared. The tenant listed on the lease was Chloe Harding. On the right side of the screen, the private text messages between Harrison and Chloe scrolled upward in agonizing detail. The specific message where Harrison called our wedding a ridiculous charade and mocked me for paying the bill was magnified for the entire congregation to read. And right in the center of the screen, impossible to ignore, was the black and white ultrasound photo of their unborn child. The silence in the church completely shattered. It was no longer just gasps of surprise. It was sheer, unadulterated outrage. The high society guests, the people Beatrice had spent decades trying to impress with her fake aristocratic pedigree, were now pointing at the screens and whispering furiously. The facade of the Kensington family was not just cracked, it was entirely pulverized into dust. Beatrice Kensington lost her mind. She stood up from the front pew, her sapphire blue designer gown rustling loudly. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, hideous rage. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone shook violently as she began to hyperventilate. "You liar!" she shrieked, her voice echoing horribly through the sacred space. "You vindictive, pathetic little liar! You forged those messages. You are trying to destroy my son because you know you are not good enough for this family." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. "I did not forge anything, Beatrice," I stated calmly into the microphone. "But your son certainly did, and since we are on the topic of transparency, I felt it was only right that all the key players in this financial enterprise be present for the final audit." As if summoned by a perfectly orchestrated theatrical cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary burst open. The loud, heavy thud echoed down the long white aisle runner, cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. Every single head in the church turned toward the back entrance. The afternoon sunlight poured into the dim vestibule, framing a woman standing in the doorway. It was Chloe. She was wearing a tight emerald green maternity dress that clearly highlighted her 5-month baby bump. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her face was flushed with confusion and anger. She stood there gripping her designer handbag, breathing heavily as she surveyed the massive crowd. The timing of her arrival was not a coincidence. It was a precise, tactical maneuver. 15 minutes ago, while Harrison thought I was crying in the bridal suite bathroom, I had taken his synced iPad from my tote bag. I had opened his messages and sent an urgent, panicked text to Chloe. I told her the bank executives were demanding to see her in person before they finalized the commercial loan. I told her the entire Boston penthouse lease depended on her immediate arrival at the church. Driven by pure greed and a desperate need to secure her luxury lifestyle, she had fallen for the bait completely. Harrison Chloe called out, her voice shrill and demanding as she began to march down the aisle. "What is going on? Why did you text me to come down here? Where are the bank executives?" She stopped dead in her tracks, halfway down the aisle. She finally looked up and saw the massive projector screens hovering above the altar. She saw the ultrasound photo of her own baby displayed next to the forged commercial loan documents. She saw the text messages proving she was an active participant in a federal wire fraud conspiracy. The arrogant, demanding expression melted off her face, replaced by absolute paralyzing dread. She looked at the 300 guests staring at her in disgust. She looked at the bank executives in the third row who were currently writing down her name in their legal notebooks. Then she looked at Harrison, who was standing frozen at the altar, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Harrison, what did you do?" Chloe stammered, taking a terrified step backward. "You told me the loan was secure. You told me she was going to pay for everything." Her loud public confession was the final nail in their coffin. There was no spinning the narrative now. There was no hiding behind the Kensington family name. The mistress had just openly admitted to the fraud in front of an entire church full of witnesses. Beatrice snapped. The realization that her grand financial bailout was completely destroyed, that her family name was permanently ruined, pushed her over the absolute edge of sanity. She let out a guttural, terrifying shriek and charged up the altar steps. She did not care about her sapphire dress or her high society manners. She lunged directly at me, her hands outstretched like claws, desperate to rip the microphone away and physically attack the woman who had brought down her empire. "You ruined us!" Beatrice screamed, her eyes rolling back with pure fury. "You ruined my son." "I will kill you." I did not move. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, my posture radiating pure, unbothered authority. I did not need to fight Beatrice Kensington because I had already called the cavalry. Before Beatrice could even reach the top of the altar steps, a massive, imposing figure stepped out from the very front pew. Attorney Richard Hayes moved with the lethal, terrifying speed of a seasoned legal predator. He completely blocked Beatrice's path, placing his broad shoulders solidly between the screaming matriarch and me. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of expensive tailored wool and absolute legal authority. "That is far enough. Mrs. Kensington," Richard commanded. His voice was deep, gravelly, and entirely uncompromising. It cut through Beatrice's hysterical shrieks and silenced her instantly. Beatrice stumbled backward, her chest heaving as she stared at the tall, imposing attorney. "Who do you think you are?" she hissed, pointing a shaking finger at his chest. "Get out of my way! This is a private family matter." "I am Richard Hayes, senior partner at Hayes & Vance Litigation," Richard replied smoothly, "and I am Olivia's legal counsel. This ceased to be a private family matter the moment your son forged my client's signature on a federal banking document to steal $500,000. As Richard spoke, two men stepped out from the side aisle. They were wearing unassuming plainclothes, but the heavy badges hanging from their belts caught the light of the church candles. They were detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit, and Richard had briefed them entirely before the ceremony began. They moved with calm, practiced efficiency, flanking Beatrice on both sides and completely cutting off any potential escape route for Harrison. The two plainclothes detectives moved past Richard Hayes with the synchronized precision of men who did this for a living. Their heavy leather shoes clicked against the polished stone steps of the altar. The sound cut through the thick, suffocating silence of the church. The entire congregation held its collective breath. I stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of an auditor closing a final ledger. Harrison stumbled backward. His hands, which had been holding mine so warmly just moments ago, were now raised in front of him in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. In the third row, the senior executives from First National Bank were already on their phones. They were frantically whispering to their legal teams, distancing themselves from the Kensington family as quickly as humanly possible. They looked at Harrison not as a valued commercial client, but as a toxic liability. The grand illusion of the Kensington wealth was dead, replaced entirely by the ugly, undeniable reality of federal wire fraud. "Harrison Kensington," one of the detectives said, his voice echoing loudly across the vaulted sanctuary. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Harrison shook his head violently. His perfectly styled hair fell across his forehead, ruining his princely image. He looked completely unhinged. "No. Wait, there is a massive misunderstanding here." He stammered, his hazel eyes wide with absolute panic. He turned to me, his hands reaching out in a desperate plea. "Olivia, tell them. Tell them we were just merging our finances for the business. Tell them you agreed to this loan." "Please, Olivia, tell them you signed it." He was still trying to gaslight me. He was still trying to weave his toxic web of lies while a federal agent reached for a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. I looked at him with absolute zero pity. My posture was rigid, my expression carved from ice. "I did not agree to be your collateral, Harrison," I said smoothly, my voice projecting clearly through the altar microphone so every single guest could hear his humiliation. "And I certainly did not agree to fund your luxury penthouse in Boston for your pregnant mistress." The detective grabbed Harrison by the shoulder, spinning him around with forceful authority. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping closed over the cuffs of his custom-tailored tuxedo echoed like a gunshot in the quiet church. The reality of his situation finally hit him. His knees buckled slightly as the detective secured his wrists behind his back. The golden boy of Connecticut high society, the man who thought he could steal my future to fund his lies, was being hauled away in chains at his own wedding. Beatrice Kensington watched her son being shackled from the front pew. The color drained completely from her sharp, aristocratic face. She let out a sound that was less of a scream and more of a hollow, guttural wheeze. The sheer weight of her failure crushed her instantly. Her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard stone floor of the church aisle. Her expensive sapphire blue designer gown pulled around her in a pathetic, wrinkled heap. Her heavy diamond necklace clattered against the floor, highlighting the absolute ruin of her fake dynasty. She began to sob uncontrollably, tearing at her own hair. "My family," she wailed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. "Our legacy? You ruined us, Olivia. You ruined everything." She tried to reach out and grab the pant leg of the lead bank executive sitting nearby, desperately seeking a lifeline. The executive looked down at her with intense revulsion and literally stepped backward, pulling his leg away from her grasp as if she were a diseased animal. The wealthy socialites Beatrice had spent decades trying to impress were now looking down at her with undisguised disgust and morbid fascination. They were whispering behind their ceremony programs. They were snapping photos with their phones. The prestigious Kensington name was entirely pulverized into dust. Beatrice was no longer a powerful, intimidating matriarch. She was just a bankrupt, disgraced woman, thrashing on the floor of a church, exposed to the entire world as an extortionist. I turned my attention away from the pathetic display on the floor. I walked slowly down the altar steps, the heavy silk train of my custom wedding gown gliding smoothly over the stone. I walked straight down the aisle toward Chloe. The pregnant event planner was standing frozen in the middle of the church, her hands protectively clutching her stomach. She looked at me with absolute paralyzing terror. She knew I had the text messages. She knew her face had just been broadcast on the projector screens alongside the fraudulent loan documents. She knew she was deeply implicated in the money laundering scheme that funded her luxury lifestyle. I stopped directly in front of her. The scent of her expensive perfume mingled with the church incense, but I did not flinch. I looked at her emerald green maternity dress, the beautiful fabric that was ultimately paid for by my stolen savings. I lifted the expensive bouquet of imported white roses that my maid of honor had handed back to me. I pressed the bouquet firmly into Chloe's trembling hands. "You are going to need these more than I do, Chloe," I said, my voice dripping with cold, measured authority. "Consider it a parting gift, because when the federal investigators seize that Boston penthouse and freeze your bank accounts tomorrow morning, these flowers will be the only valuable thing you have left. You helped him steal my money to build your perfect life. Now you can figure out how to pay for your own mistakes. Enjoy your new reality." Chloe let out a choked sob, clutching the white roses against her chest as she watched her entire future evaporate. Her knees shook, and she leaned heavily against the wooden edge of a pew, entirely destroyed by the truth. I did not look back at her. I did not look back at Harrison as the detectives marched him down the side aisle toward a waiting police cruiser. I did not look at Beatrice weeping uncontrollably on the floor while the bank executives marched out of the building. I simply turned and continued my walk down the main aisle. The guests parted for me automatically. They stepped back, giving me a wide, clear path, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and profound respect. I saw my parents standing in the front row. My father had his arm wrapped tightly around my mother. They were looking at me not with embarrassment, but with profound, undeniable pride. My father gave me a firm nod, a silent acknowledgement of the incredible strength I had just displayed to protect our family. I smiled at them a genuine, warm smile and kept walking. The heavy oak doors of the church stood wide open at the end of the vestibule. The bright, brilliant afternoon sunlight poured into the building, washing away the dark, suffocating shadows of the sanctuary. I walked straight out into the light, leaving the lies, the fraud, and the toxic rot of the Kensington family behind me forever. I stepped out onto the warm concrete, taking a deep breath of the fresh, clean air. The faint sound of police sirens wailed in the distance, a perfect soundtrack to my victory. I was no longer a naive victim caught in a trap. I was a free, empowered woman who had reclaimed her life, her finances, and her future with absolute, undeniable precision. Women can sacrifice and we can be deeply loving partners, but we must never let love blind our intellect. When greedy people back you into a corner, do not just cry. Use your mind, gather your receipts, and show them exactly what happens when they underestimate you. If you felt completely satisfied watching this arrogant family get exactly what they deserved, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.